So back in December, I wrapped up my 4th semester of college, that being the fall 2023 semester. It was also my second to last semester of college too, as next week I'll start my final semester and in May, I'll be graduating, which is super exciting and really cool to think about since I just graduated high school back in December of 2021, and my first semester of college began around this time 2 years ago. It's crazy to see how I went from being a 17-year-old terrified of his drug-dealing roommate to a now 19-year-old with a lot to look forward to. That's why I've always loved doing Storytime, as throughout the 3 years I've been doing the series, I've been put in a place where I've had to look back at specific time periods in my life. So for this Storytime, I figured I'd do just that by looking over both my second to last semester of college, as well as by far the most chaotic semester of college I've had. I'm Zach, and this is Storytime 57, on January 5th, 2024. Now, for those who have not seen Storytimes 46, 47, or 51, I should probably explain a few things first because you're probably completely lost from my intro. So I enrolled in a local public university in January of 2022, after graduating from high school a semester earlier than everyone else. When I enrolled at this college, I enrolled as a junior rather than as a freshman, as the high school I went to was an early college, which is basically a school where you get both your high school diploma and an associate's degree when you graduate. Saves a ton of time and money, and I loved every second of my time at the school, and I'm still a legend at that school today. Now, this also means that I'm far younger than most of my peers. In fact, I will be graduating at 19 years old. I don't mean to brag, but I think that's pretty cool to mention since I'll already have the equivalent of a master's degree before I'm even 20 years old, since I'll be graduating with over 150 credit hours. Meanwhile, everyone else is 21 or older, which I always tend to forget since I'm pretty much fully adapted to being the youngest student in all my classes. But whenever I do consciously remember that, it's still cool to think about. Now, you might be asking what I'm studying. So I'm working towards a degree in accounting with a minor in economics. I've always been great at math, and I've always been a big introvert, so it's no surprise why accounting is my perfect fit. I'll specifically be going into tax accounting, which I'll mention later in the story time when I talk about by far the biggest thing that happened this semester. Both accounting and economics are fields that fit my description perfectly, so it makes sense why I chose this major and minor. So that's a little background about my school. But another big thing that's greatly impacted my time in college has been work. So in November of 2022, I applied to be a tutor for my school's tutoring department, and I was offered a job, which I began in January of 2023. Initially, I only tutored business calculus and principles of accounting 1, but in March, I added elements of statistics to my course load, meaning by the end of the semester, I was tutoring 3 classes. However, we were also allowed to tutor over the summer, if we wanted to, and we could do our appointments 100% online via Zoom. Who wouldn't want a remote part-time summer job? That's what came to my mind, so I signed up to tutor over the summer, where I tutored my usual course load in addition to principles of microeconomics, principles of macroeconomics, and managerial economics. Microeconomics was a little bit of an issue, but because I made 100 on 2 of the 3 exams I took in managerial economics at spring, which is a class that's pretty much like an advanced microeconomics class, I was still qualified. So I began offering it and still tutor it to this day, alongside macroeconomics and managerial economics. However, I wouldn't get a lot of appointments over the summer for economics, as the very vast majority of my appointments were for business calculus. I'll talk more about my summer tutoring later. So that's a little bit of background of what I was doing for those who have not seen Storytimes 46, 47, or 51. Getting through my classes and helping others do the same. Pretty awesome. Now, to begin the story time, instead of going straight to the beginning of the semester like I always do, I'm first going to start with the summer of 2023, as this was a very eventful summer for academics and tutoring. So let's start with academics. So my school offers 5-week summer classes for students who might have failed a class or just simply want to get ahead. Even though I've never even made anything lower than a B, I've always taken summer classes to get ahead. This summer would be no exception, as I ended up taking 4 classes, 2 at a time. All of my classes were online, with 2 of them being asynchronous. The others were synchronous, that met on Zoom. The first 2 classes, which lasted from May 22nd to June 28th, were Management 3140, which is Management and Organizational Behavior, or just Management as I'll refer to it as, and Communications 3160, which is Business Communications. Let's start with Management. So initially, this course was meant to meet every weekday from 11:15 to 12:45. However, our professor mentioned that we would not need that much class time, so instead, we only met on Thursdays at that time and the rest of the class was fully asynchronous. This class simply went over how managers make decisions, how to be a good manager, and what organizational behavior is. This was one of those business core classes I and every other business major at my school has to take. These are a selection of upper-level courses designed to broaden our understanding of business, with an emphasis placed on management. Some examples of business core classes I took prior to this summer that you'll recall if you saw Storytimes 47 or 51 include business law, management information systems, operations management, and financial management. Managerial economics is also a business core class, but accounting majors don't have to take it, although I still had to take it for my minor. Business communications as well as the course from the second half of the semester were also business core classes. After this summer, I would only have one more of those classes to take, which I'll be taking this spring semester and discussing it in the story time about my last semester of college. Anyways, back to management. This class was probably the most forgettable class I think I ever took. The only things we did in this class were our weekly online quizzes, our online weekly discussion boards, and weekly quizzes. Well, our classes as well. We did not have any tests in this class, just the weekly assignments, so you can kind of see why this is a forgettable class. But at least that made for an easy and stress-free class, which isn't something I usually experience when taking college classes, so it is definitely nice to have. I ultimately ended up making a 95 in this class, giving me by far the easiest A I've ever received during my time in college. The other class I took during this time was, of course, business communications. This, too, was an easy class like any communications class usually is. However, it was a little more challenging, as it had a lot more material to cover and there were a lot more assignments, although this class didn't have any tests. That felt incredibly nice since that meant I got to go a whole 2 months without having to worry about exams. While I'm an incredibly good test taker, I just hate the anxiety I get from them, which is why I prefer project-based stuff over tests. Anyways, the thing I remember most from this class was the analytical report project. For it, we had to write a lengthy report comparing two businesses and determining which business we should invest in. For my paper, I decided to compare Target and Costco. The beginning of the paper included basic information about each company, as well as each company's history, and then it expanded more into a multitude of business metrics, including but not limited to each company's competitive abilities, business strategies, stock history, and challenges. Now initially, I thought this was going to be a rather simple and easy project. However, that would not be the case. Rather than being a simple and compare and contrast paper, it ended up being a gigantic, comprehensive report that included practically everything I've learned throughout all my business core, accounting, economics, and math classes all for this random paper for some business core class. Yeah, I went all out for it. So let's talk about my paper. So to start, I basically introduce each company by talking about what each company sells, how they do business, and their history. Very basic stuff. Then I moved on to the qualitative characteristics. So for it, I discuss each company's main competitors, specifically with regards to monopolistic competition as I learned back in managerial economics. I also talked about each company's business strategy and future plans and commented on my thoughts regarding them, something we did in management as well as what we do in managerial accounting, which I'll get to later. I also talked about each business's marketing strategy and how that comes into play, so marketing was a big part of this project too. Then came the quantitative characteristics. This is where I brought up each firm's financial data via their 2022 financial statements as well as their stock price history. Let's start with the financial statement portion of this section, aka the accounting and supply chain management portion of the section. Even though the directions didn't specifically say how long we were going to hold our investments, I assumed that our investments would be held as trading securities, meaning that we would hold them between 3 months and 1 year. This is so that these investments cannot be considered cash equivalents but not long-term investments, since those are more strategic decisions that require judgment from a higher up like a CFO or another manager in the department. This also made it easier for me when determining what financial and operational ratios to use, since this limited myself to only focusing on liquidity, which is a company's stability and performance in the short run, rather than solvency, which is for the long run. So, for the ratios in question, I used 3 ratios. The first ratio I used was the current ratio, calculated by dividing current assets by current liabilities. Despite being by far the most simple accounting ratio there is, it's a very important one when determining a company's liquidity, since it tells you how easily a company is able to pay off its short-term debts. The second ratio I used was inventory turnover ratio, also called ITR. This is a supply chain ratio used to determine how many times a company sells their whole inventory. It's used by logisticians and supply chain managers to evaluate how efficient a company's materials requirements planning (MRP) system is and how to assess how much inventory a company should purchase to minimize storage cost. It can also be used to calculate how many days on average it takes a company to sell off its inventory. It's calculated by dividing cost of goods sold by the average inventory value throughout the year. The third ratio is a ratio that you've definitely heard of. It is not only by far the most important financial ratio there is, but it's by far the most important ratio in all of business. That ratio is earnings per share. Earnings per share tells you how much a company makes per share of common stock outstanding, calculated by dividing net income, also called profit, by the weighted average number of common shares outstanding throughout the year. That's basic earnings per share. There's also diluted earnings per share, which takes into account convertible securities as well as stock options. But I only calculated basic EPS since the diluted variances are more for internal users. Then comes by far the biggest thing from this paper, the stock history section. For it, I used Yahoo Finance to look at each firm's stock price history all the way back from January of 2021 and then transferred the data into an Excel spreadsheet. From there, I calculated the rate of return for each month. After that, I calculated each company's expected rate of return, variance, standard deviation, and other statistical measures. I then used this information to calculate the probability of getting a positive rate of return for a given month for each firm. I ended up getting a negative rate of return for Target and a positive expected rate of return for Costco. After that, it was back to the qualitative characteristics, where I had to talk about recent publicity that these companies faced. For Target, I talked about the whole drama with the LGBTQ merchandise and how they lost a ton of sales from that. For Costco, I talked about their auditor, who also happened to be Silicon Valley Bank's auditor, so I mentioned how the collapse affected other clients, including Costco. After all that, it was time to make my decision. I ultimately decided that Costco is the better company to invest in, and I guess we'll have to see in a bit after if I was right, since all about time that the financial statements for 2023 are going to be released. So yeah, that was a shit ton of content in this massive 8-page paper. And what grade did I make? An 88. I think the reason I didn't do so well on this project was because I went maybe a little too in-depth on the research and arguments, as my professor, who is supposedly my boss in this case, didn't have a background in business. His undergraduate and master's degree was in journalism, so he didn't know much about business, and I kind of went way over the top of his head with some of my calculations, since the statistical calculations I used for the stock price section is definitely not easy to understand for someone without a math or finance background. But I'm still happy with the paper, as I feel like I did incredible on it and got the opportunity to combine my knowledge and what I've learned from all different business fields into one comprehensive report. Overall, while I didn't do as well in the analytical report as I had hoped, I still came out of business communications with a 94, so I earned an A in this class, mostly stress-free class. So, those are the two classes I took the first half of the summer. For the second half of the summer, that being from July 5th to August 9th, I took 2 more classes. First class I'll talk about is Economics 3112, which is econometrics. Econometrics is basically applying statistics to economic events and predicting economic outcomes. Y'all know that I'm pretty big into statistics, which is why I decided to choose this class as one of my 3 elective economics classes required for my minor. However, this class was by far one of the hardest and most dreadful classes I've ever taken, mainly because it was an asynchronous 5-week course. Had I taken it over a regular semester, it might have been a little better, but it was just an absolutely crazy hard and nerve-wracking class. Practically half of the notes in this class were Greek symbols, and by the time we got to multiple regression models, I had no idea what was even going on. This class is actually considered to be the weed-out class for economics majors, since it's required for the degree and is practically all you do if you get a master's in economics, so you can see why this class was so hard. That's why I ended up finishing this class with just an 84, as it was that hard. In fact, I was worried that I wouldn't even be able to pass the final because the content from the second half of the course was so brutal, but a B is still better than anticipated, so I'm more than willing to take that. But what if I told you that despite making only an 84, I actually ended up getting an A in this class? Yeah, even though I only made an 84, which is a low B, my professor rounded up my grade all the way to an A. I don't know if everyone else was struggling as much as I or what, but I was sure as hell happy when I saw an A had been assigned. So I can now say that I made an A in a weed-out class for a very difficult major despite not even being that major, which is pretty hilarious to think about. The other class I took was Marketing 3140, which is Principles of Marketing, or Marketing as I'll just call it. If you saw Storytime 45, you might recall me taking a marketing class my senior semester of high school. However, just like business law, community college marketing and university marketing are 2 completely different classes, so I had to retake it. Marketing is often considered the easiest business core class, which is expected since marketing is a super easy major as well, and sure enough, this class was pretty easy. In fact, the toughest part about it was literally getting through classes, as since class was on Mondays and Wednesdays from 5:30 to 9:15. but I usually just messed around on the internet or played video games during this time, since no way in hell would I be able to sit for a whole 4 hours discussing rather boring and uninteresting material, even if my professor had a good sense of humor. Now, how the class worked was that there were 3 exams as well as a project. The exams were bullshit easy, as our professor literally made a study guide that had all the answers to the test, and she let us use the study guide on the exams. So the exams were easy A's. As for the project, there's a lot more to comment on it with regards to it. So this was a group project where we had to come up with a product or service and create a marketing plan for it. I actually did this exact same project from community college marketing back in 12th grade. So if you've seen Storytime 45, you know exactly what's going on. Only difference is that for this project, we also had to present our product or service to the class. Me and my group decided to come up with an app called Park Stats. Basically, parking on campus is a complete nightmare. I'm lucky enough to have lived on campus for the entirety of my time here, but I have driven around on and off campus during busy times, and let me tell you, parking spaces are practically non-existent on campus Monday through Thursday from 7:30 to 5, since my college has a reputation for being a commuter school. Seems like other students and faculty have the same issue. But instead of investing in parking spaces, my school decided to instead expand their football team and tailgating park, despite the fact that we only won 3 out of our 12 games this season and can't even fill half of our stadium. In fact, we didn't even score a single point during homecoming. That's how fucking terrible my school's football team is. I really wish my school would actually invest in their students and faculty more and invest in things that actually matter, such as parking spaces or research funds, rather than on some lame-ass football team that loses more than the Carolina Panthers. So that's where Park Stats comes into play. Park Stats is an app that you can use that locates parking spots around campus, uses statistics to determine how often specific parking spaces are available on a particular time of day, and tells you how long it will take you to reach your parking spot from wherever you are. Would definitely be a great app if it was actually created for students and faculty, since it would make parking a lot less stressful. Now, we were assigned this project the first day of class, and we worked on it all throughout the class until we submitted it as our last thing for the class. Me and my group would meet up virtually after each class, as well as during other times to work on the project and discuss ideas. Overall, the project's development was a success, as our professor and the class really liked our idea and were all very interested in our product, which is exactly what you want from marketing. We as a group made a 96 on the project, and I came out with a 92 in the class. So those were all the summer classes I took. With the exception of econometrics, I had a pretty good and easy course load for the summer. Outside of school, I was also doing well. Despite being summer, I still had high demand for tutoring, especially in business calc, as around 80% of all appointments for the summer were for this class alone, and I could definitely understand why, as taking any math class over the summer can be very challenging. I also saw high demand for statistics, which is also understandable for the same reason, as well as a little bit of demand for accounting. I'm quite surprised none of my other classes had as high of demand, especially in managerial economics, since this is a business core class that can be especially brutal to take over the summer, given how much calculus and statistics is involved in this class. But at least I get way more demand for it during fall, which I'll talk about later. I would also pick up a new class to tutor at the end of the summer, that being Intermediate Accounting 1. So even though I struggled immensely in this class back when I took it during the fall 2022 semester, I came out super successful in it, with my exam average being a 92 and my final grade in the class being a 94. I've always been on the edge about tutoring this class, as it is very difficult. However, after going through the notes from this class and realizing just how simple the material actually is compared to what I initially thought when I took the class, I decided that it would be in my best interest to tutor it. Therefore, I decided to begin offering tutoring for it. Since I already tutored an accounting class, I didn't need to get a recommendation from a professor in the accounting department, although I'm sure my intermediate accounting professor would have 100% recommended me given how much she respects me. So now, I was and still am tutoring 7 classes. It's a lot, but I get plenty of hours to feel really refreshed since I'm almost never tutored the exact same thing every day. As for everything else, it was also going great. While everything was going fine, there was one big issue. Church. So I've complained about my church back at home so many times throughout Storytime I can't even keep count. It's pretty much your typical Bible-thumping Southern Baptist megachurch that has beliefs you usually associate churches of its kind with. Even worse than its outdated beliefs are its fake-ass motherfuckers from youth. So I used to be very close friends with the guys in my grade. They were a vital part in helping me overcome depression and getting back to my knees after I attempted suicide back in 8th grade. However, 3 months after my attempt, these guys decided they didn't like me anymore. So at a church trip called Fuge, they left me out and then proceeded to laugh at me for it. I went into detail about it in Storytime 56, but ever since I attended Fuge, I've dreaded church and began to realize that my church was pretty awful, and I'm also beginning to dealing with religious trauma from both what happened at Fuge, as well as some of my church's beliefs. Whenever I'm home, my parents force me to attend church. In fact, I've been dreading being dragged to church since the beginning of my 3rd semester, and I'm even dreading having to return to it this summer when I graduate. And as time has gone on, religious trauma has only got worse, but I can't say that it's been completely bad, as it's also had its positives. The main positive has been deconstructing. So this summer, I began to critically examine my church's beliefs and came to the conclusion that their literal and fundamentalist view of the Bible is not only completely outdated, but taken way out of context. Some of these beliefs that my church held include the idea that homosexuality is an abomination, strict gender rules, aka women can't be pastors, men must always be the head of the household, etc., and cult-like behavior, such as being told not to hang out with non-Christians, being told that God is watching our every move, and being told what to think, how to act, who to talk to, and what to listen, etc. While I am not deconstructing my religion entirely, as I still 100% consider myself a Christian, I'm specifically deconstructing the evangelical beliefs I've been force-fed all my life and told that's the only way to believe. And I've gotta say, while deconstructing often makes me feel guilty just because how big of an evangelical I was a few years ago and how it's what I've grown up with all my life, it's incredibly liberating and I've never felt more free. The main thing I've gained from it is that unlike what my old church claims, the Bible is not a book of rules or a guide to being a Christ follower. In fact, the Bible is not 100% accurate, which I think is actually a fantastic thing because the Bible is actually meant to show that mankind can never achieve perfection, no matter how God-fearing or inspired they are. This helps stress the idea that we need God's forgiveness. Once I made this realization, I had never felt more free. No longer do I feel guilty about watching an R-rated anime or movie, or listening to a Powerwolf song, as God's above all this and loves me no matter what. I've been freed from the chains of the evangelical church's toxic and fundamentalist rules and beliefs, specifically with regards to their beliefs that you can't be a Christian if you do this, or that, and man does it feel nice. Another realization I've made from deconstructing is that Jesus would despise my old church. I've read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and after reading all 4 Gospels, I counted so many similarities between my old church and the Pharisees and religious leaders of Jesus' day that I stopped taking count. I also came to the conclusion that Jesus absolutely hated religion, particularly how the religious leaders of his time often used it to maintain control over their people, just like what many modern evangelical churches do. So for me to find myself in a similar position to Jesus gave me a huge confidence boost, and really did reinforce the idea that God wants me to abandon and call out my old church since he sent his son to do exactly that, of the church of his day. However, if there's one belief my old church had that I still maintain, it's that church attendance is important. Even though I don't think church attendance is mandatory to be a Christian, unlike my old church's pastor who flip-flopped on this idea whenever it appeased his bullshit beliefs, I do think it is important to attend church at least once a month to learn about God and worship him. So that's why I decided to begin researching different denominations and seeing what they believed in. The denomination that immediately caught my interest was the United Methodist Church. Like every other denomination, Methodists believe the same things about salvation and being saved. However, it seemed like the United Methodist Church had similar beliefs to me with regards to the Bible, that it shouldn't be taken literally and especially not out of context. So I began looking up Methodist churches near my college and found one about 25 minutes away that I really liked. So I began attending it in September, which I'll get to then. Spoiler alert, I still attend it today and I now fully consider myself a Methodist. So that's what's been going on with church. Of course, I haven't talked to anyone from my old church in years besides my buddy Zach, and even he isn't a big fan of the church's beliefs despite being the son of the pastor's second-hand man. And yes, you heard that right, his name is also Zach, meaning we are required to be friends by law since we have the same name. So yeah, that's been one of the main things going on with church and religion. And with that, there isn't much to talk about for the summer. I did go on a few road trips with my grandmother, but I want to specifically focus on college and the story time, so I'll talk about those in another story time. But yeah, that's the summer of 2023. So without further ado, let's move on to the fall 2023 semester. Let's first talk about move-in day. Normal move-in day was Wednesday, August 16th. However, because I was granted special permission by the tutoring department, I was allowed to move in on Saturday, August 12th. So that's what happened. The night before, I gathered all my things to prepare for the move-in, and then the next morning, me and Dad got my stuff loaded and headed to campus to move in. Initially, I was expecting this to be a smooth process, as I was moving in early. However, it seems like a whole bunch of other student employees were also moving in early, as we were in a big line getting to my hall's loading deck. And when we did arrive, things were not ready whatsoever. The front doors directly to the elevator were locked, and the only unlocked doors were to the front office, which was much further away. Thankfully, some people offered to stand by the elevator door and open it, so at least we had that. So yeah, moving in was difficult just because housing was not prepared whatsoever. Although this was still better than carrying 50 pounds for 3 hours in 90-degree weather like I endured my second semester of college. But after getting everything moved in, Dad wished me good luck and then I got to work moving around my stuff in my bedroom until I got a layout I liked. Once I had it, I was officially moved in. So now let's talk a little bit about my housing assignment. So for this semester, as well as for the spring 2024 semester, I'm in an upperclassman hall. As for my specific room, it's an apartment style room with 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen, and a living room, meaning I get my own bedroom and have 3 roommates. All of my roommates had already known each other, so I was the new person moving in. And I've got to say, they were super awesome guys. These 3 were also seniors, so they were a couple of years older than I was. But they were all super friendly, very nice, and fun to be around. They respected each other and me and were the best roommates I could have asked for. Even when they brought their friends over and occasionally got loud in the living room, I didn't mind, nor did I ever feel unsafe since I knew they were really cool and wouldn't do anything. They also invited me to join with their friends, which I would whenever I didn't have schoolwork, and I really liked their friends. So yeah, amazing roommates hands down. Now, they also moved in early, as 2 of them were members of my school's marching band, while the other was a student employee like me, although he worked for our school's housing department, so I got to meet them early as well. So yeah, that was my housing assignment. While not as fun as having an entire living room and bathroom to myself like my second semester, it was a great housing assignment and I'm happy to have it again for the spring. Now for the next few days, because the dining halls were closed and so was most of everything, I didn't really do a whole lot. I brought snacks with me and visited Food Line the night I moved in, so I was stocked on groceries. So with that, let's move on to Thursday, August 17th. So this alongside Friday, August 18th, were important days regarding tutoring, as they were all orientation days. These were meant to let us know our fellow tutors, gain some tips and tricks for tutoring, that kind of stuff to celebrate the new semester. All tutors must attend Thursday's orientation, while only new tutors are required to attend Fridays. Since this was my second semester tutoring, third if you count the summer as its own semester, that meant that I wasn't required to attend Friday. But because these orientations literally last 7 hours, and we get paid to attend, I figured why not and attend Friday as well so I could get in more hours. Most other returning tutors also had that mindset, as many of them attended both days. Anyways, the orientations themselves weren't anything super interesting, especially since I knew everything that we were being taught. So things like positive reinforcement learning, Bloom's taxonomy of learning, FERPA and other legal matters, work etiquette, and more. My job has super lax rules anyways, especially since my boss respects me a ton, so it's a pretty easy rule to follow through. However, this orientation would allow me to make a new friend. So at the beginning of Thursday's session, our boss had us log on to Poll Everywhere to answer a question. The question was about implicit biases and how to stop them, basically just HR stuff. However, I guess someone accidentally submitted the poll code, as they literally answered the question with the poll code, which was our boss's first and last name followed by 203. Our boss made it so that we could submit more than one entry since she wanted us to come up with multiple solutions. She also had it so that the answers would show up on the big screens in the lecture hall we did our orientation in, meaning all the answers were public, although we didn't know who submitted what since it was just a word wall. Me and the guy sitting next to me saw it, so we had the bright idea of submitting multiple entries to that submission just to make it larger on the word wall, and as the more popular an entry is, the more centralized and larger the submission would be. So we continually submitted it over and over until it was the largest word on the word wall. But the best part is that it continued after we got bored, as I think just about every attendee submitted at least one entry for it. So when it came time for our boss to commentate on our submissions, we all had a good laugh when she made fun of us for submitting the code. Me and that kid I submitted multiple entries with high-fived, and that pretty much started our friendship. Learned that his name was Evan. Evan had been tutoring for a semester longer than I have, as he started tutoring in the fall 2022 semester. He's an industrial engineering major who tutors a multitude of math classes from college algebra to Calc 3 to differential equations. I've seen him multiple times back in the spring semester, but I never interacted with him until orientation, so it's cool to start talking to him and eventually becoming buddies with him. We'd often tutor at the same time, so we saw each other a lot throughout the semester. So with that all said and done, let's move on to the beginning of classes. So we'll start with the first day of classes, being Monday, August 21st. The first class I want to discuss is a class that might confuse you a little bit if you've seen any of my previous story times. That class is Accounting 2122, aka Principles of Accounting 2. This seems like a very unusual class for me to take, as I'm a senior accounting student who had up to this point taken 2 intermediate accounting classes. So why was I taking a basic 2000 level accounting class that all business majors take? Well, the reason is because I actually never took this class. Rather than taking it after Principles of Accounting 1 back in the summer of 2022, I went straight into Intermediate Accounting 1 that fall, as I was initially an accounting and finance double major. But after taking financial management that spring, I decided I didn't want to get the finance degree, so I dropped it. However, that placed me 2 credits under 150 credit hours, which is the amount needed to sit for the CPA exam in my state, North Carolina. Therefore, all that was needed was an additional class, so I just figured I'd take this class since I never took it and it would be stupid easy A, so that's what I did. Anyways, Principles of Accounting 2 differs from Principles of Accounting 1 because rather than focusing on financial accounting, aka what we do in intermediate accounting, this class focused on managerial accounting. Managerial accounting, more commonly known as cost accounting, is more for managers and other internal users to assist in decision making. So while this is still a stupid easy class, I actually didn't get to use much of my advanced accounting knowledge in this class as much since this class focused on different type of accounting than what I'm used to, which was really refreshing and interesting for me since it was still in my field of study, but with completely different focus. In fact, I'd say that my economics background helped me more in this class than my accounting background, as managerial accounting specifically focuses on cost and minimizing them. So while everyone else was using basic equations or formulas for certain problems, I was using derivatives and other calculus techniques I learned back in business calc and managerial economics to solve problems quicker. As for my professor, she was great. Even though I didn't pay too much attention in her class like most classes, I still think she did great. Her method of teaching was to have us fill out guided notes, and then during class, she would work out the problems in the notes and explain them. Whenever I did pay attention, I could easily understand her and follow along easily, which is exactly what a good professor should be like, so she was great. When we get to September, I'll talk a little bit more about her since I visited her office one day and that's how I ended up being one of her favorite students in the class afterwards. Now, this class was from 10:10 to 11 a.m. and it took place on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. It was also my only Friday class, which was always super nice. What was also nice was that on Mondays and Wednesdays from 11 all the way until 2:30, I had nothing to do. So this would usually be my time to go to the dining halls and eat lunch, and then lay it down for a little bit or do schoolwork, whatever I felt like doing. However, once it hit 2:30, it was back on the grind, as from 2:30 to 3:45 on Mondays and Wednesdays, I had accounting 4220, which is income tax, or tax as I'll refer to it as. So the vast majority of accounting students usually go into public accounting, where they work in either audit or tax. Therefore, it makes sense to have us take a tax and audit class as seniors to help those of us planning to go into public accounting, which field we want to go into. When I do my story time about my last semester of college, I'll talk about how the audit class went, since I'll be taking it this upcoming semester. Anyways, tax is pretty much an overview of the federal income tax system. Most of our time was spent on individual tax returns, although we did touch some on corporations at the end of the semester. In this class, we basically talked about how tax liabilities are calculated, what counts as what under each part of the tax liability process, and rules for them. And then for the business side, we talked about business deductions with heavy emphasis placed on maker's depreciation, alongside other stuff and how it affects taxable income. This is probably the most important class I have and ever will take at college, since it's actually what I'll be doing when I graduate, which I'll talk about in a bit. As for my professor, he was really chill. He's a big sports fan, especially with Kansas team since he's from Kansas. And yes, he did make a Wizard of Oz joke the first day of class about it. He also had prior experiences working in public accounting and doing taxes, so he would often comment on what he saw in practice and how what we're doing in class is applied in practice. So he's a good professor. I also want to comment on my classmates too, as we all got along really well, which being seniors in a 4,000 level accounting major class, that's kind of expected, but I don't think I've ever been in the class during my time at college where everyone seemed to get to know each other and get along. I found myself getting along pretty well with a group of girls, and I'll actually be taking 2 classes with them next semester too, so this class was also pretty good. Immediately after tax would be when I would begin work, although it wouldn't start until September. I would do my drop-in tutoring hours on Mondays and Wednesdays from 4 to 7. These were times when students could just drop in and get tutoring. I'll talk about these more when we get to September, as these would be far crazier than I ever could imagine. So that was my Monday and Wednesday schedule. Now let's move on to my Tuesday and Thursday schedule. On these days, my first class of the day was Accounting Information Systems, or AIS as I'll refer to it as, which meant from 10 a.m. to 11:15. It's pretty much like Management Information Systems, MIS, a class I took my 3rd semester of college, but with an accounting focus. That class was cool, but probably one of the least memorable classes I ever took. On the other hand, AIS is definitely a class I'll remember for a long time because all the proposal project we did in this class that really tested every last bit of patience I had that I'll be talking about later. But other than that project, the rest of the class wasn't anything too difficult. It was just simply fill in the blanks from the lecture notes provided, do the pre-lecture quizzes, and take our test. After AIS, I had an hour and a half break until my next class, so I spent it in the same way I spent my Monday and Wednesday break by eating lunch, laying around or getting some schoolwork done, but then at 1 o'clock, it was time for my next class. So this class was Accounting 3325, which is Intermediate Accounting 3. In Storytime's 47 of 51, I discussed my experience taking Intermediate Accounting 1 and 2, respectively. Even though I had a fantastic professor for both of these classes whom I still talk to this day, these were very difficult classes. In fact, I consider these two classes and econometrics the same difficulty. That's how hard these classes were. But nothing would have prepared me for the sheer difficulty that is Intermediate Accounting 3. I unfortunately didn't get to take this class with my old intermediate accounting professor, as this class was exclusively taught by one professor. That professor happened to be my professional development for accounts professor I had that spring. Since that was just a one-credit class and was more about our prospective lives after college, I didn't really get a feel for our professor's teaching style since he almost always had professionals come in to talk to us. But since I had no other option, since he was the only professor who taught this class, I had to take him for his class. And my god was this class atrocious. Let's start with my professor's teaching style. So he was not a good teacher. He went very fast, especially near the end of the class where he would rush through material as fast as he could while completely overwhelming me and everyone else. Additionally, his way of teaching was just reading off slides, which made things even worse since there were a lot of things he required us to do differently than what the book said. For example, our second to last chapter in the course was about leases. The way the book recorded journal entries for leases is that it would do two separate entries for the lease payments and amortization. However, our professor wanted us to combine the two into one entry and expected us to do as such on our exams. While not the hardest thing to do, it was still annoying since our homework had us do two separate entries. Additionally, he required us to make notes after every journal entry we did on exams, whereas in Intermediate Accounting 1 and 2, those weren't required. So sticking with the example of leases, if we were recording the entries for lease payments and amortization, underneath our entries, we would have to write to record payment of lease for year X and amortization of lease for year X. Even though this doesn't seem bad, we had to do this for every single entry on exams, which took up quite a bit of time. I'll talk more about exams and just how brutal they were when I get to talk about the first exam for this course. But even class time itself was awful as well. During class, our professor utilized Poll Everywhere to have us do problems during class and practice. While it did provide for great practice, its use was completely hindered by the fact that it was 5% of our course grade and was graded based on accuracy. And these were not simple were you paying attention type questions. No, these were full-on problems similar to what we would see on exams. I, alongside most people, learn best by actually practicing material, not from listening to our professor lecture on stuff. But clearly our professor didn't understand that, as he assumed that by him just saying something, we'll immediately know how to do specific entries and other stuff. As a tutor, I know damn well that's not how people learn. You have to actually visually show them how it's done, and then have them try it for themselves in a stress-free environment, not make it count as part of our grade. So yeah, my professor sucked because of him, this class would go on to be the hardest class I ever took in college and the second hardest class I've ever taken period, only behind Algebra 1 back in 8th grade. And the worst part was that it didn't even have to be this hard, as the material itself wasn't that hard. It was just that my professor required us to go way above and beyond and expected far too much on exams, to the point that 90% of students didn't finish exams on time. So yeah, this is a very brutal class I'm so glad to be done with now. Oh, and my professor also liked to keep us a few minutes late. That might not seem like a big of a deal, but considering the class was supposed to end at 2:15, and I had to be at work at 2:20 by 2:20 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, this proved to be a massive inconvenience for me and others who also need to get to work or class. Speaking of work, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I offered one-on-one appointment tutorings. So these days, students can sign up for individual appointments with me. Between these, group appointments, and drop-in tutoring, this is my favorite method of tutoring, as not only am I just focusing on a single student, but I'm also more prepared since I know what they're going to ask about, so I usually perform better in these than drop-ins. However, I still have one more class to discuss, that being Economics 3151, which is Law and Economics. This class met exclusively on Thursdays from 7 p.m. to 9:45, so it was a late night class. This class was basically about how legal issues affect economies and economic decisions by both firms and the government. However, the professor for this class was a complete wacko. teaching was his part-time job, as he was actually a judge, which is really cool since he could tell us some stories about dumb and crazy criminals who've come into his courtroom. However, that's not too crazy, although he did talk about driving 2 hours every day to work, which I think is a little overkill, as I think he should just move closer since then because that cannot be fuel efficient at all. But what made him crazy was the ground rules he put in place the first day of class. So his first rule was that laptops were prohibited. Even though I didn't like this rule, I do completely understand his reasoning for it, since it could prove to be a distraction, especially in a 3-hour night class. But what made this rule super weird was that he said that he'd had some students come up and thank him for instituting that rule. Immediately in my head, I called bullshit on that one, as there ain't no way anyone has thanked him or any professor for treating him like a middle schooler in a 3,000 level college class. There's just no way anyone has done that. On top of that, he also seemed to have a superiority complex, which I'll give him the benefit of the doubt for since he is a judge, but he was pretty much saying that he was above the rules and that the rules don't apply to him, which baffled me. In all my other classes, whenever a professor set ground rules for the class, they too would follow those rules as well. Like if a professor didn't show up within 15 minutes of class attending, we were allowed to leave early and not get that counted against us. My professor brought that rule up in particular and said that if we did that, there would be consequences since he also placed a strict attendance policy that was even stricter than my Western history professor's policy for my first semester in college. Where this time, if we missed even one class, we would get a letter grade drop. Yeah, that's crazy. And just like my Western history professor, he was also very indirect and unclear about rules and stuff too that weren't outlined in the syllabus. And just to make things worse, when someone asked him for clarification, he would get upset and remind them that he's the professor and they're the student. Just super irritating. I still question why he's even allowed to teach if he's going to disrespect students like that. I'll complain more about him later and talk about why I ultimately did with this class later. For now, let's talk about my Friday schedule. So Fridays were usually my easy days. I had Principles Accounting 2 that morning, and then I would have 2 hours to myself. And by the way, my Principles Accounting 2 professor never assigned tests on Fridays, so Fridays were always a super stress-free day. And then at 1 o'clock, I would begin working. So on Fridays for tutoring, I would also be doing appointment tutoring. However, these would be group appointments, where I could have up to 3 2Ds for a single appointment for the same class, meaning if one 2D signs up for an appointment on Fridays, 2 more 2Ds could sign up for that same appointment, but it has to be for that specific class. So if a 2D signed up for a statistics appointment at 2 o'clock, 2 others could sign up for that time slot too, but it must be for statistics. It can't be for calculus or any other class of tutor. This makes things a little tougher, since now I have to focus on more than one student. But to compensate for it, I get paid 50% more for group appointments, so Fridays were usually the days I made the most money. They were also just super stress-free anyways, so Fridays were always great days. Now, being the first week of the semester, you'd think that I was not that busy. Well, you'd actually be wrong, as I ended up getting quite a few appointments the first week of class. My first appointment for the semester, which was on Tuesday, August 22nd, was a calculus appointment where the 2D wanted to go ahead and sign up for a recurring appointment since he knew this would be a tough class. Recurring appointments are something we could do with 2Ds who want to do appointments on a weekly basis. I did this with him and a few others this semester, so I would meet with them at the same time every week. These recurring appointments were very useful for this 2D in particular, as he ended up making an A in the class despite not being a big fan of math. Now, I should mention that drop-in tutoring did not start until September, so I was doing entirely appointment tutoring for the time being, and I still had good demand for just the first week of tutoring, especially in managerial economics. Contrary to the summer, I began seeing a ton of tutoring for it, which felt super nice since not only was it giving me a good amount of hours, but it's also my favorite class as well as my favorite class to tutor alongside statistics, so that made work all the more enjoyable. And yeah, that's pretty much my first week of class. I was getting acquainted with my new classes pretty quickly and was ready to begin the semester. But on top of work and school, I also decided to go back to something that I've both praised and hated on throughout my time doing Storytime, that being swimming. So I used to swim competitively from 2016 to 2019. I talked all about how it started, absolutely loved it, then began hating it when our team got a new coach who claimed swimming was more important than school, as well as trying to be as big of an asshole as he could to me and anyone else who swam for fun and not to quote-unquote win. Winning in swimming is about beating yourself, not others, something I don't think my coach really understood since he always compared us to others. However, despite quitting the team in 2019 and taking a 2-year break, I still found myself interested in swimming and wanting to return. So during the summers of 2021 and 2022, I joined a summer swim team and had a blast with them. However, in June of 2023, I turned 19 years old, making me ineligible to do summer swimming since I exceeded the age limit. I also didn't have time since I was working and doing my summer classes. but in order to get back into swimming, I decided that I would begin going to my school's gym, which had an indoor pool, and do individual practices there on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Since it had been over a year since I last swam, I decided to start easy and then progressively do more and more until I was back in shape. That didn't take too long to do, especially given the motivation I had to get back into swimming. And thanks to it, I managed to beat every single personal best I've ever had, as well as do some events I thought I'd never swim, such as the 400 IM, 200 butterfly, and the 1650 free. I'll talk more about my progression with swimming throughout the story time, since it would also pave the way for what I'll be doing this coming semester. So yeah, I was doing pretty well with school, work, and swimming. Let's move on to the second week of classes. First, I want to talk about a project we began in AIS. Not the project that gave me hell, but a different one. So this project was our Excel project. The goal of it was to get us better at using Excel and using more advanced functions. So how the project worked was that it was split into 8 parts. For each part, there were detailed step-by-step instructions, as well as a video our professor made going over each step. So this was a very basic follow the instructions type project. Each part was only took around 30 minutes to do. And the way each part was graded was by us taking a quiz during the project where we would answer questions using steps from the project, as well as uploading screenshots of our work. It was a super basic and easy to get through. I ultimately came out with the whole project with a 99.43, as there was only one question on the entire project that I didn't do correctly, although I still got partial credit for it. So therefore, this was a super easy project. The best part is that we would have another one just like it, but for a different software, which I'll get to when we get to discussing November. Now, the other big thing that happened this week was something that Storytime 47ers might remember, that being Meet the Professionals. So this is a big networking event my school hosts for accounting majors every fall, where a ton of accounting firms, from Big Four to large regional firms to small local firms, come to our school and introduce themselves to us. It also gives us the opportunity to network with professionals, give these firms our resumes, and just get acquainted with the professional world. Meet the Professionals this year was on August 30th and 31st, as well as September 6th and 7th. Now, in the fall of 2022 semester, my main reason for attending this session was to try to land an internship for the following summer. That unfortunately didn't happen, as I was rejected by every firm I applied to, which is somewhat expected given how awful the job market is. But at least this was also when I met that cute redhead I went on a date with that November. Unfortunately, it didn't go further than that since she rejected me when I asked her out again, but it still brings back great memories and was definitely the biggest highlight of that semester. However, at this Meet the Professionals, I was not playing around one bit, as my goal was to land a full-time job for the following summer since I'm graduating with my 150 credit hours in May. Therefore, I handed out my resume to every firm, networked as much as I could, and hoped for the best. And sure enough, I got lucky, as I got a lot of callbacks from multiple firms and got interviews set up with many of them. However, while I was happy to attend Meet the Professionals, there was someone who wasn't happy with me attending it. That was my law and economics professor. So as mentioned, he had a super strict attendance policy and had a superiority complex. So when I emailed him a week before the event started, as what he instructed us to do in the case of foreseen absences, he responded with a very angry email telling me that this was no excuse to miss 2 of his classes. He then made a huge mistake in his email when he said that I'll need to decide between his class or Meet the Professionals, where he then very eagerly told me that I should choose his class since this event would be a waste of time. Right after reading that part, I decided to choose Meet the Professionals since it had the chance of landing me a job rather than attend his crazy-ass class. I also calculated my grade with 2 absences, and found the highest grade I could even make in this class is a C. Therefore, I decided to withdraw from law and economics since there was no way in hell I was going to miss out on an important networking opportunity just to appease some entitled piece of shit who could care less about me. And looking back on my decision, I think I made an incredibly good decision. As it didn't just avoid a red flag, I dodged a tactical nuke. From what I heard, this professor went off on students about every class period and was just such an unbearable guy to be around. He also graded things extremely inconsistently, and there was no way of telling whether or not you were doing good or bad on assignment, so I'm glad I withdrew from his class, especially since the second day of Meet the Professionals, Thursday, August 31st, proved to be one of the most important days of the semester because I met a particular firm who took a big liking into me and I did the same with them. That night, I applied for a tax position, and very quickly, the recruiter reached out to me and scheduled an interview. I'll talk more about the interview in a bit. Now, going back to law and economics, there was an issue with dropping the course. So a minor in economics requires us to take principles of microeconomics, principles of macroeconomics, and managerial economics, all of which I've satisfied. However, we also have to take 3 elective economics classes of our choice. I already satisfied one with econometrics. Law and economics was going to be my second class to satisfy this requirement. However, since I withdrew from it, that means I'll have to take 2 economics classes this spring rather than just one to satisfy my minor requirements. That's why I'm taking both intermediate microeconomics and intermediate macroeconomics this spring rather than just taking one of them. But considering both of these classes aren't terribly hard, especially since I've already had managerial economics, they won't be too tough. While it's kind of inconvenient that I have to take an additional class next semester, it's still better than remaining in law and economics with that piece of shit professor, so I can't complain at all. So with that all said, let's move on to September. September was by far the best month of 2023, as it would be the month where my stress and anxiety about my prospective career finally ended after a whole year of worrying about it. So as said earlier, there was a particular firm at Meet the Professionals that gained a special interest in me and got an interview set up with me. So the interview was on Wednesday, September 20th. That night before, I prepared myself immensely for it, prepared some questions, got myself ready. I also emailed my Principles of Accounting 2 professor that I wouldn't be able to attend the class, so she was able to excuse my absence. She would also take an interest in me doing this interview and follow up by asking how it went, which I'll get to in a bit. Anyways, the interview itself went about as great as it could have gone. I talked to 2 higher-ups in the firm, and they were really cool, really funny, and very chill people. In fact, with the first one I talked to, I think I had him laughing about 2/3 of the interview, especially when I told him that what makes me unique is that I know how to depreciate land, which in accounting, depreciating land is the butt of many jokes since you're not supposed to depreciate it. So yeah, this interview was not only a success, but it's also really fun. However, that Friday, September 22nd, I would receive the greatest news I could have ever asked for. So after getting off of work, I was in my room and just chilling when I got a phone call. I then picked up the phone and immediately recognized the voice when he asked if this was me. I didn't answer yes, and that's when he gave me the exciting news. He was very impressed with my interview performance and wanted to offer me a position for next summer. Immediately, I became so excited and thrilled as he continued making comments about my performance and being impressed with my resume. I thanked him multiple times during the call, and I could tell he was super excited for me as well. He then told me the next steps as well as when I would receive my offer letter. Afterwards, we kind of had some casual conversation and then we wrapped up the conversation. Right after the phone call ended, I screamed about as loud as I think I've ever had. Already my body was shaking immensely and I was breathing heavily as well. I then got out of my bed and started running around my dorm as all the stress and anxiety I've had all year about work were released. I was so worried about not having a job lined up or even having an internship that summer, as I was scared that I would be at a disadvantage and not have a job after school. But just from that short 10-minute phone call, all of that worrying and stress went away, and God did it feel so amazing. I truly felt on top of the world. After I calmed down a bit, I then called Dad. I told him the news, and he too was absolutely thrilled. We then talked for a little while about it and about what all that meant and all. However, I was still really out of control, and even after calling Dad, Dad actually told me that during our call that I should go swim to calm down. So I decided to go to the gym and do my swimming. I was actually planning on skipping that day, but since I was just so out of control, it was definitely a good idea to release some energy at the pool. So that's what I did. Afterwards, I decided to celebrate by getting some takeout Chinese. I had recently found a takeout place near campus that serves some really good chicken and broccoli. So I called in the order and went to pick it up 10 minutes later. And man, did it taste so good. Not just because our food is fantastic, but just because the way it was to celebrate me finally being relieved of all that stress I've had throughout the year. Now, as for what I'll be doing, I'm not going to be revealing too much or really talking about my future job as a whole, even when I do begin. The reason is because not only is that private information, but my job will expose me to confidential client information that I obviously cannot reveal publicly. Therefore, you're not going to be hearing much about my job in future story times, as I do want to protect mine, my company's, and clients' privacy. However, I will mention that what I'll be doing is where I'll be. So I'll be a tax associate working in my company's Charlotte office. Since I'm from Charlotte. So as for my duties, I'll be working on corporate tax returns. So basically doing tax returns for companies and corporations. This is why I mentioned tax being the most important class I've taken at college. So that's actually what I'll be doing for my job. Just that I'll probably be working on a specific area of a corporate tax return rather than the whole thing. Additionally, as I move up within the firm, I'll also be focusing on specific industries rather than all industries. Since Charlotte is a major banking and finance hub, I'll probably end up doing returns for a lot of banks, insurance agencies, and other financial centers. That's about the extent of what I'll say that I'll be doing, but I think that gives you a good idea of what kinds of things I'll be getting myself into. Over the next month, I spent some time reading over the offer letter as well as making sure everything seemed fine. Everything did, and I was very pleased with the benefits that from my offer letter. So in October, I signed the offer, meaning I'm now officially set to begin working next summer. So yeah, I'm all set for my post-college life, and I just get more and more eager about starting as the days go on. Also, as you can expect, this is probably the greatest thing that could have ever happened to me in my mental health-wise too. The very vast majority of my stress and anxiety from 2023 was about my post-college arrangements, specifically with finding a job and stuff. It was only amplified further by the fact that I had no internship, so I was coming in with zero experience. And knowing the job market, that could be brutal since a lot of companies expect fresh college graduates to already have 5 years of experience, so this completely takes out all the stress and anxiety. It also takes the stress out of my schoolwork. No longer do I need to worry about maintaining a high GPA to impress prospective employers. Rather, all I need to do now is simply pass my classes and get my degree. In fact, I even calculated my prospective GPA and found that if I just simply make C's in all my classes next semester, I'll finish college with a 3.38 GPA. If I make all B's, I'll finish with a 3.55 GPA. The company I'll be working for only requires a GPA of 3.25, so there's absolutely no pressure on me for upcoming classes this semester. Although I'll do well in order to maintain at least a 3.5 GPA, since that was the goal that I set myself when I started college. So yeah, that was by far the biggest and greatest thing that happened not only this semester, but of all of 2023. September 22nd also marked the best day of 2023 for me, and so did the month of September as a whole, as it taught me a very valuable lesson. Always believe in yourself and keep going. Now, going back to September, Dad was not the only person I told, honestly. I also told my intermediate accounting 1 and 2 professor since she was super supportive throughout my job search. When I visited her office that following Monday, she was delighted to see me, and even more delighted when I told her the news that since I often asked her advice regarding job hunting back in her class. I also thanked her for some of the accounting knowledge that I got to use during the interview, as using it, making it humorous, and making the interviews laugh their ass off was what I needed to land the job. I also emailed my Principles of Accounting 2 professor to let her know what happened since she too was looking forward to hearing the results. She was also beyond thrilled to hear that I was offered a position and invited me to her office one day to discuss. So I did and ended up having a pretty awesome conversation with her about it. She of course congratulated me and all that stuff, but we also talked about non-accounting related stuff, which was super unique since I had never really talked about a whole lot of non-class related stuff with a professor before. But it was really cool and I really enjoyed talking to her. That also marked the moment when I became one of her favorite students, even if I never spoke up in class since I'm usually not one to. She also would make a point to talk with me whenever she could, and so did I. So not only did getting a job relieve me stress, but it also made me really close with a professor I probably otherwise wouldn't have interacted much with. So yeah, this job offer was exactly what I needed at this point. And since then, I've been doing excellent and have been nowhere near as stressed as I was my second and third semester. And next semester, I'll probably have one of the least stressful semesters I'll ever have, so I'm really looking forward to it. So with that said, let's get back to academics. To start, let's talk about the first round of exams I took. So before I get to talking about exams, I want to mention how they were structured, since all of them were actually quite similar. So all of my exams this semester were paper and pencil exams. In Principles of Accounting 2 and Tax, we were also only allowed 4 function calculators, while in Intermediate Accounting 3 and AIS, we could use any calculator of our choice. Personally, I didn't like this rule too much since we had to use graphing calculators in calculus and statistics, both of which were also business major requirements, so it was annoying having to buy a little 4-function basic calculator. But at least it was cheap, but still kind of annoying. Anyways, let's talk about the first exam I took this semester, that being for Principles of Accounting 2, which I took on Monday, September 11th, 2023. This test was by far the easiest test I took this semester, since it was literally about the managerial accounting and some basic stuff involving it like contribution margin, product and prime cost, and other stuff like that. We actually did this stuff at the end of Principles Accounting 1, since the last quarter of that class was on managerial accounting. So as you can expect, I breezed through this class. All of our tests in this class were multiple choice too. I only made a 94, but nonetheless, I was still pleased with my grade. Then the next 2 exams I took though were a lot tougher. The reason is because I took them on the same day. I took both my first exam for AIS and Intermediate Accounting 3 on Thursday, September 14th. Unfortunately, this would not be the first time this happened. I'll start with my AIS exam since I had that class first. So the exam was also a basic exam that was on the basics of AIS, as well as a little bit of review from ILMIS, which I barely remember anything from since it was the most forgettable class I took my third semester, although alongside professional development for accountants. And I have to say, this is a super easy exam. It consisted of 55 multiple choice questions, all of which I breezed through in less than 30 minutes. And even though I only made a 95 on it, I still consider this to be probably the most fair exam I've ever taken in college. Literally every question on the exam could be traced back to our lecture notes, which is what I used to study. There were no surprises whatsoever on the exam either, so it was a very fair exam. Like, even had I made a 40 on this exam, I still would have had the same thoughts about it as I did with the 95, since it truly was a fair exam that's an easy A if you just simply put the time. So yeah, props to my professor for this exam. Too bad our next unit would be a project that made me lose my shit, but at least I had this exam to be happy with. As for the third exam I took this month, that would be my Intermediate Accounting 3 exam, which I took just 2.5 hours after finishing up the AIS one. I made a friend at Meet the Professionals who took this class back in the spring, and he warned me about exams with this professor and just how brutal they were. I took his word for it and studied my ass off, and holy shit, he was not wrong in the slightest. This exam was absolutely brutal. A lot of questions felt badly worded, as well as felt like stuff we never went over or did in the homeworks. And don't even get me started on the free response problems. The problems take so much time to do, and as a result, I did not have enough time to finish the exam entirely, leaving one problem unanswered. I was so unconfident about this exam since I didn't have enough time to finish, and it seemed like everyone else felt the same way, as almost nobody finished the exam on time. That should have been a red flag for our professor, since if very few people can finish their exams on time, then you're likely either asking too many questions or expecting too much, as in his case. However, he tried to make the excuse that his GA took the test and finished it in an hour and 10 minutes. I call complete bullshit on that claim. For one, his GA is a master's in accountancy student, so using her as a sample makes literally zero sense statistically and logically, since she didn't even fit the criteria tested. That's like using an NFL team stats to determine how well a local high school football team will perform. Additionally, a friend of mine went to the GA's office hours to ask her for help with some topics, and she had no clue how to solve the problems, so it was clear that this claim was bullshit. Just as I said with talking about my law and economics professor, I absolutely despise it whenever professors try to make up shit that's so obviously false, especially when they're supposed to be the experts in their field. But ultimately, I made a 72 on this exam, the lowest grade I ever made on the intermediate accounting exam, which I was actually quite happy with, as I thought I did way worse in this exam given how tough it was. But at least after taking it, I knew exactly what my professor expected on exams, which allowed me to do way better on the next 3 exams in this class. Then the next week, I had my last exam for the month, that one being for tax. It took place on Wednesday, September 20th, the same day as my interview. It was definitely a refresher from Intermediate Accounting 3, as it was a lot easier and it too was far more fair like the AIS one. I thought I did relatively well in the exam after I finished it up, so after turning it in, I was pretty satisfied, but nothing would have prepared for me for the grade that I got. While I was expecting around an 85 on it, I ended up making a whopping 107 on this exam. So if landing the job isn't proof that I did well in that interview, my grade on that tax exam will hopefully be sufficient enough for you. The exam had 107 points total on the exam, but it was only graded out of 100, so there was like a built-in curve to the exam. Our professor also curved the exam more as well, although my grade didn't change from that since I made the highest grade in the class. I think this is the highest grade I've ever made on any exam throughout my time in college, even higher than that 104 I made on a statistics exam my second semester. This pretty much was the moment that made me realize that I was probably going to do way better in tax than I initially expected, as I was expecting a B in this class, and I'd be right about that suspicion, as tax would go on to be not only the class that I made the highest grade in this semester, but the class that made the highest grade out of every single class I've taken in college. So that's how exams went for September. The first exam were always the hardest ones since you don't really know what to expect. But then every other exam afterwards is usually a lot easier to prepare for since you know what's going to be on it. Now that I've wrapped up exams for the month, let's talk about that awful project for AIS that I mentioned earlier. So we began work on this project after finishing up our first exam, and we would work on it all the way until November. Additionally, once we finished, we also took an exam on the project too, although the exam itself was actually pretty easy. Anyways, the project in mind is called the Systems Understanding Aid, SUA. The SUA is this big packet of documents and books that consist of the bookkeeping for Warren Sports Supply, a fictional Chicago-based sporting goods wholesaler that sells athletic equipment to colleges and universities in the Midwest. Our job for the project was to take the role of the general manager, Ray Kramer, as well as his subordinates to prepare the last few entries for December of 2022, as well as the month-end and year-end adjusting entries once we finish with the remaining entries. Ray Kramer is also a bitch-ass motherfucker, as you're about to see in a little bit. Speaking of bitch-ass motherfuckers, this whole project might as well have been the closest I've ever been to completely losing every last bit of sanity, because holy fuck was this project the most agonizing, torturous thing I've ever done in not just college, but in my academic career. Every other night from when we began all the way until November, I spent around 3 hours on this piece of shit. as not only was each part so time consuming to do, but the instructions were so extremely vague and made zero sense whatsoever, which is why I spent 3 hours a night on these. It was also tough to even figure out whether or not I was doing something right or wrong, since while our professor provided check figures, he only provided check figures for the calculations, not the actual paperwork. So I had no idea if I was placing something in the right or wrong place, only making me feel worse and worse about myself and the whole project as a whole. Additionally, the project itself was so hard to keep organized because there were so many documents and booklets that were part of the project. Let's start with the documents. So there were quote-unquote 27 documents included in this project, or in the packet. However, there could be multiple of each document, so multiple document 5s or multiple document 14s. To make matters worse, 2 of the same documents could be for different things. So one document 5 might be for shipping invoice, while a second document 5 might be a check. And just to make things more confusing, some steps in the process use multiple documents, but you aren't told specifically which documents to use, so you have to flip through all the documents and figure out which ones to use. The complete disorganization and lack of consistency in this project absolutely frustrated me and made the project more about determining what documents to use rather than learning what the purpose of each document was and how it's used, completely defeating the purpose of this project. The same can be said about the booklets too. In fact, I'd argue that they were even more disorganized than the documents. While there were only 4 of them, each of them managed to be even more disorganized than the documents. One booklet was the journal, so it was where we would place our journal entries. However, what made it really confusing was that there was also special journals for specific transactions like purchases, cash disbursements, and more alongside the general journal. So it was often a challenge just trying to figure out what entry would go where, or even if I would record something in the journal. The same can also be said about the ledgers booklet. It also had special ledgers of all the accounts and war and sports supplies data, such as cash, accounts receivables, accounts payable, etc. But then there was also a general ledger that we would sometimes use. This completely confused me because sometimes we would use the general ledger, while other times we would use the special ledgers, and there was no consistency with it either. Like, it felt like we switched between the general ledger and special ledgers at random. There just wasn't any consistency at all with it. The other booklets weren't really anything too special. I never touched the references booklet, while the instructions and flowcharts booklet was where the instructions were, which, as said, those made very little sense. Now let's talk a little bit about my man Ray Kramer, because this motherfucker committed a serious felony midway through the project that our professor, who was literally an auditor prior to being a professor, failed to detect. So one of the last transactions involves salaries, where Kramer gives himself a huge raise while he gives his subordinates small raises. Very suspicious, but not entirely illegal. But wait, there's more. One of the main internal controls Warren Sports Supply had in place was verification of raises, meaning raises had to be approved by the general manager, that being Kramer himself. Therefore, Kramer was able to just casually approve of his own raises without anyone batting an eye, which is a massive red flag since that makes it easy for him to steal a shit ton of money from the company. And it seems like he's doing just that by giving him consistent huge raises after each month, since his pay data was also made available for all months. This is a failure to maintain separation of duties on Warren Sports Supply's parts, as to maintain stable and effective internal controls, companies need to give roles to different employees to reduce the risk of an employee abusing their power. Therefore, assuming Kramer isn't the CEO, what I think should be in place is that someone else should improve the general manager's raises. So maybe someone in corporate or someone above Kramer. They also just need to fire Kramer too, since he's stealing all the company's profits, get a forensic accountant on his ass, and charge him with fraud. So yeah, this project was absolutely atrocious. From it being super disorganized to the instructions being vague to the general manager casually committing fraud, this project was absolutely awful. I'm sure anyone else who took this class can relate, since this project is used for AIS classes at almost every college in the nation. I'll talk more about the SUA when we get to October, which was when we started to work on the month end and year end entries. For now, let's take a break from talking about academics and talk about something rather hilarious that happened in the middle of Intermediate Accounting 3. So about a week after our first exam, specifically on Tuesday, September 19th, we were just having a normal class when our professor was simply lecturing. That was until this obnoxiously loud ring buzzed outside the hall. Although it wasn't that loud, it was still loud enough for our professor to not be able to continue lecturing. So he went outside and noticed that this buzzer was actually a fire alarm. So he ordered us all to get up and walk outside into a nearby field, where me, everyone else in our class, and every other class being held had to hang out outside while we waited on the fire department to take care of the alarm. Most people grouped up to talk to each other while I kind of just chilled and did my own thing. While waiting, I overheard some students talking to each other about why they thought the fire alarm went off. That's when I overheard one of them say that someone set off the fire alarm off on purpose to get out of their exam. And to be honest, I could actually see this happening, since it seemed like these students were in Intermediate Accounting 2 and were in the classroom across from where my Intermediate Accounting 3 class was, and they were actually taking an exam right as the fire alarm went off. However, honestly, this probably didn't happen, but considering how hard Intermediate Accounting 2 was back when I took it last spring, I could see why someone set off the fire alarm in the middle of an exam. Really stupid and immature idea, but I mean, given the nature of that class, I can understand. At the same time, I also thought to myself, just wait till you get to Intermediate Accounting 3, since those guys were complaining about only the second one. Anyways, let's move on and talk about work. So this month, drop-in tutoring started. As I said earlier, drop-in tutoring is basically a form of tutoring whereas students can drop in to tutoring center and get tutoring for whatever class they want. I offered drop-in tutoring back in the spring semester for the 3 classes I tutored at the time, and I never really got many people. In fact, I only had 5 unique 2Ds show up the whole semester. However, this semester, I ended up getting way more 2Ds for drop-ins, and by way more, I mean a 500% increase in drop-in 2Ds. While I was happy to see higher demand and more 2Ds showing up, I was not expecting this whatsoever, especially since I was barely got anyone during the spring semester, so I was quite confused as to why I was getting far more 2Ds than the previous semester. But after talking with my boss, there's a couple of good reasons for this. One is that we usually have busier fall semesters, since not only are students more refreshed and have a higher motivation to do well in their classes, but there's also more students, period. Comparing enrollment rates at my school between fall and spring semesters is absolutely hilarious to do, as we have about a 50% dropout rate for freshmen. That's why spring semesters at my school are extremely tame compared to the fall semesters, as we have so few students after chopping our freshman class in half. So that kind of explains things. But as for why this semester was super busy in particular, might have to do with how many students were admitted. So my school admitted their largest freshman class in their 80-year history this past fall, which if you ask me, I think that's the single dumbest thing ever, because with the parking issues, a housing crisis, and shortage of courses, I just don't see why we should be admitting so many freshmen if we don't have the capacity to admit so many. But I think there are at least some explanations as to why I was so busy with this semester for tutoring. Unfortunately, next semester will probably not be as busy since it'll be a spring semester, but it's still interesting to see the stats and try to find explanations for things. Anyways, my first day of drop-in tutoring, I had 7 2Ds, which is a lot, and I was excited to have a lot of them. However, I quickly realized that it wasn't going to work out since they all came from different classes. In fact, on my second day of drop-ins, I was using up to 4 tables in the learning commons at the center. One for business calc, one for managerial economics, one for statistics, and one for principles of accounting 1. Legit, so many people had come for drop-ins and the demand only got more and more, so that's when I had to talk to my boss about it, as it was super overwhelming trying to go back and forth between subjects. My boss completely understood my issue, given that it could also cause an issue for other tutors who need spaces to do their tutoring. Therefore, she proposed that I set specific days and times for each of my subjects. At this point, I was doing drop-in hours for all the classes I tutored for on Mondays and Wednesdays from 4 to 7. But after hearing more about the strategy, I planned out when I would have what, which I determined that the best strategy would be to offer tutoring for macroeconomics, microeconomics, and managerial economics on Mondays and Wednesdays from 4 to 5:30, principles accounting 1 and intermediate accounting 1 on Mondays from 5:30 to 7, and business calc and statistics on Wednesdays from 5:30 to 7. I think this worked out great, as not only did my demand ease a ton, but now I was able to be more organized with my classes and did not have to switch between one subject to the next every 10 minutes. So this strategy worked out perfectly. It also paved the way for how I'll be doing drop-ins next semester, as rather than splitting my subjects by time slots, I'll be splitting them up by days. So I'll be doing shorter drop-in sessions, but only one subject a day, which should work even better. So yeah, school was going great, work was going great, my prospective career was going absolutely fantastic. What else could go right this month? Well, an additional thing that went right was church. As mentioned earlier, I decided that this semester I wanted to find a church near college to start going to. Just not no evangelical Baptist church with a Bible-thumping pastor that spews a whole bunch of bullshit like the preacher at my old church. Of course, that's what interested me in the Methodist denomination, since they're nothing like that. And so one Sunday, I decided to attend a church I found. And I have to say, I think I found not only the perfect church that aligns with my beliefs, but also a church that would give leaders at my old church a heart attack by some of the things they do and believe. If my old church would disapprove, that's how I know I'm at the right place. So let's talk about some things that my new church, that my new church does that my old church would greatly disapprove of and even call blasphemy, given their closed-minded and outdated views. For one, this church does baptism a lot differently. So at my new church, we baptize babies by sprinkling water over their heads in hopes that when they are old enough to make a decision, they can get rebaptized, or be born again as we call it. At my old church, baptism by immersion was the only acceptable form of baptism, and any other form of baptism was considered illegitimate. They also only baptized when someone made a decision, which is why I wasn't baptized till I was 13 years old. Personally, I think baptism is overcomplicated by all denominations. I personally don't consider it to be all that ritualistic or even that important, as I believe God cares more about your heart and soul than if you've been shoved into a pool of water or sprinkled. So when I witnessed a baby being baptized with sprinkles, I was only shocked because it was my first time seeing it, not because I disagree with what was happening. I'm sure my old church would have absolutely freaked the fuck out since they think baptism is like the most sacred ritual ever, but I digress since I don't think it's that big of a deal as Christians make it out to be. Another thing different about my new church is that we ordained female pastors. Last year, the Southern Baptist Convention, SBC, which is the denomination my old church was affiliated with, went on a rampage of excommunicating churches with women pastors, using a poorly translated and super out of context Bible verse written by Paul as an excuse for their sexist decision. They also said that women pastors paved the way for sexual immorality, which still cracks me up whenever I hear that because this is the same denomination that was exposed for covering up hundreds of sexual abuse allegations, all of which would involve male pastors and church leaders being the perpetrators. That's also a huge reason I left the SBC entirely, as I can never be a part of a group that not only commits these horrifying and despicable acts against innocent and vulnerable children, but also has the nerve to cover it up and refuse to take accountability. To make matters worse, these churches also defend domestic violence by forcing women to stay with their abusive husbands by telling victims of sexual abuse that the abuse is their fault and that they need to forgive their abuser. It's just downright disgusting what they do, and I'm sure if hell even exists in the first place, which I've lately been questioning the existence of, I hope that these men who commit these horrific acts against women and children have a special place down there for them. Anyways, getting back on topic, my church has multiple pastors, including a couple of women pastors as well as women serving as deacons. My old church strictly forbid women from holding church leadership roles, citing 1 Timothy as a reasoning despite the fact that their verse was aimed at a specific group of women at a church who were preaching sexual immorality, not all women. In fact, the next verse even suggested that women not even be allowed to talk in church, but clearly my old church didn't abide by that rule since women were allowed to talk. That's why it's very important to not only understand what the verse actually is referring to, but also understand historical context and what time the verse was written in before jumping to conclusions on how we should be living in 2,000 years later. As for the women pastors themselves, they're super sweet and really cool. I've talked with one of them, and she was a great person to talk to and very easily approachable. It's clear that she's feeling what God wants her to do, and she's doing it very well, which I think is fantastic. And another difference regarding my new church deals with politics. Now, I do not like bringing up politics in Storytime, but there isn't any way of avoiding them here, so I'll have to bring them up, but I'll stay as neutral as possible. Anyways, my old church and new church are practically on two completely different sides of the political spectrum. As while my old church was conservative, my new church is liberal. I'm personally a centrist, as I think both sides are way too extreme and completely out of their minds, although I do not mind attending a church that leans either one of those beliefs. But what I do care about is if that church tries to shove their beliefs down your throat. At my new church, while it's clear that they do lean to the left, they never mention it during services, and the pastors do a great job keeping politics out of church. It's implied that the church is liberal, given that they are LGBTQ affirming and have a very diverse congregation. They don't really talk about it much during worship, which I really like because church isn't about politics, it's about worshiping God. Meanwhile, my old church would often use the Bible to try to tell you why you can't vote for one candidate or why you must vote for another to be considered a Christian. I think injecting either liberal or conservative ideology into a sermon is about the worst thing a pastor can do because you're not turning anyone towards religion, you're turning people towards a political ideology, and Jesus fiercely despised political and religious leaders. Another thing that makes my new church different that also continues to surprise me to this day is that our church is very welcoming and supportive of other Christian denominations. Every service, we pray for a local church in the area. Almost always, that local church is not affiliated with the United Methodist denomination. During this time, we put aside our differences and pray for that church's success. Meanwhile, my old church believed that any church not SBC affiliated is preaching filth and that should be, and is called, as they called it, and is mocking God. In fact, I remember Methodists especially being talked about during Sunday school, where my teacher would call them fake Christians, sin worshippers, and just so much other bullshit. That's part of the reason I chose to become Methodist specifically, as that was the denomination my church hated the most and complained about the most. And listen, I know I might be acting like a hypocrite since I'm calling out my old church for doing something I've been doing throughout the story time, which I'll admit that yes, I'm acting just like my old church here. But given how awful my old church treated me and how they defend abuse, I think it's safe to say that I have an excuse unlike them whose only reason for hating others is that they're different, which also explains the racism, sexism, homophobia, and other hate that that's very prevalent in their church. One last difference I want to talk about here has to do with online services. So, during the COVID-19 pandemic, my new church capitalized on online services by streaming all of their services online on YouTube for anyone who missed church, either because they couldn't make it or didn't want to get out of bed. And we fully support those who choose to watch the service online. In fact, our pastors even encouraged us to watch services online rather than physically attend whenever the weather is bad, since our church has a lot of older people who can't drive that well in the rain. And we still welcome those who watch the service online with open arms, just as we do at physical attendees. At the beginning of each service, our pastors instruct us to turn towards the camera and wave at them for the people watching online, which I think is absolutely adorable. Meanwhile, my old church also did online services, but they were super critical of anyone who watched the online services, saying that they aren't really attending church and that they're just lazy. While I agree that it's better to attend church in person, I don't think there's anything wrong with watching services online because it's still better than just not attending at all. In fact, I don't even know why they continue recording the services. They're just gonna bash people for watching them online, as it just doesn't make much sense if you ask me. So that's a little bit of information about my new church compared to the one that I've been complaining about throughout my 3 years of doing Storytime. It's so much more different and is a huge breath of fresh air compared to my old one, given that they're with the times and aren't stuck in 1951. Last thing I want to mention before wrapping up September is swimming. So after swimming for a month, I noticed I was getting back into shape, began experiencing the same physical changes back from when I used to swim competitively year-round all those years ago. From regaining my shoulder strength to regaining my endurance, I was starting to see my swimmer body come back to me. Additionally, it would also be this month where I decided to time myself in the 100 freestyle, which alongside a 100 IM was my warm-up for each practice. So I actually did a second faster than my minute 15, so I got a time of a minute 14 seconds, which is actually a second faster than my minute 15 time I set back when I was in 14, making this a new best, and I didn't even try on it. In December, I would swim the 100 freestyle again, and actually put in effort, and I'd get a lot lower time in it. However, this would be when I remembered what made swimming so much fun, beating my personal best. Therefore, I decided that throughout the semester, I would attempt to beat all of my personal best, from my oldest personal best in the 50 backstroke of 47.42 seconds, that I set back when I was 12, to my newest personal best in the 50 freestyle of 28.53 seconds that I set when I was 18. I wanted to beat all of them. Additionally, I wanted to get times for all the events that I had never swum before. Those events being the 500, 1000, and 1650 freestyle, 200 butterfly, and 400 IM. As brutal as these events were, I would also do all of them this semester, allowing me to finish the semester with every old personal best of mine beat and have a time for all events. Also, I should mention that all times I discuss in this story time are short course yards time, since the pool at my college's gym is a 25-yard pool. So with that all said, let's move on to October. October, while nowhere near as eventful as September, was still a pretty good month overall. Let's, I think to stay on topic, let's talk about swimming. So this month, I managed to get a new times for 3 events: 500 freestyle, 400 IM, and 200 butterfly. All 3 of these events are considered amongst the most brutal events in swimming, especially the 400 IM and 200 butterfly, which are often debated against each other as the hardest events. After swimming both of them, I can attest that the 200 butterfly is worse than the 400 IM. Even though it's shorter, it involves having to swim by far the hardest stroke for double length that you would in the 400 IM. Ultimately, my times in the 500 freestyle, 400 IM, and 200 butterfly wound up being 7 minutes and 13 seconds, 7 minutes and 3 seconds, also I should have did 7 minutes and 13 seconds, 7 minutes and 3 seconds, and 3 minutes and 17 seconds respectively. Sure, these times are not the best, but I'm still satisfied with them since they prove that I at least survived these 3 events, which is a lot harder than you might think, especially on the 400 IM and 200 butterfly. Additionally, I would set a new personal best on the 50 backstroke and 50 freestyle, with times of 38.47 seconds and 27.64 seconds, as well as 9 seconds and 1 second improvements, respectively. you are going to see me make incredible time saves in my new personal best, given that I'm much older when I attained my majority of my old personal best, as well as more dedicated to actually bringing down my times. That's how I dropped my 50 backstroke time by a whole 9 seconds, since the old personal best was literally set as my second ever swim meet back in March of 2017 when I was only 12 years old. However, what I really want to focus on is that 50 freestyle. The main reason I even decided to get back into swimming was to beat my personal best on the event of 28.53 seconds, which I set during my last swim meet with my summer swim club on July 7th, 2022. I've always regarded this as the greatest event I've ever swum, and I still do today, as not only did I set it as my last swim meet, but I managed to beat an almost 4-year-old personal best, as my personal best prior to it was a 29.29 second time set back in November of 2018. So for me to beat this incredible record felt super amazing. So, moving on from swimming, let's talk about academics. So this month, I took 2 exams for Principles Accounting 2, so let's talk about those. So the first exam this month, or the second exam in this class, was on Monday, October 2nd. This exam was a little easier than the first one, as expected since it wasn't my first exam, and my grade proved that, as I made a 95 on it. But then literally just a couple weeks later, on October 18th, we had our third exam. We went through the material in between exams relatively quickly, so that's why there was barely any time in between. However, my professor decided to give us an extra credit opportunity prior to this exam. So what she did was that she set up a mentor-mentee system where we could sign up to be a mentor or mentee. Mentors got to work one-on-one with 2 students to help them improve their grades, while mentees got some extra practice with the mentor. So similar to what I do at tutoring. And being a tutor, you can kind of expect what I decided to do, and that being a mentor. So I filled out the form, and soon my professor emailed me and my 2 mentees with instructions. Then the night before the exam, me and my mentees got together and found a spot in the library. The mentees I had were both really cool. They were both sophomores who, while we're not doing bad in the class, they wanted extra help before the exam. And being that one guy who's so far in the accounting program that they really shouldn't be in this class, I figured that would help them out since they were all 3 of us would get 5 bonus points at the exam during their session. So that's what we did. We ended up spending 3 hours in the library going over the material. By the end of the session, the 2 of them definitely showed a much better understanding of the material, and as a result, both of them managed to make high B's on the exam. I also was successful, making 105 thanks to the bonus points for a session. Speaking of getting with the study groups, I also did the same for my second Intermediate Accounting 3 exam. So ironically enough, I didn't actually connect with the study group through the class itself, but rather from AIS. So in AIS, I sat beside a guy named Wesley. One day, Wesley introduced himself to me and we hit it off pretty well. Learned that he was also a senior, and we're actually from the same area, and that he's going to be an internal auditor when he graduates. So he's like me in the sense that he too has a job lined up after school, just in a different field than me since I'm going into corporate tax. Anyways, Wesley has a study group for his Intermediate Accounting 3 class that he invited me to, since he and the others in the group needed some help with the upcoming exam. I gladly accepted his offer, and so the day before the exam, I met up with him and was introduced to the 2 other members of the group, and I helped them review. And as for the other 2 members, they were both super cool and very fun people to be around. One of those members was a guy named Raymond. Raymond was in the 830 section, and I've got to say, Raymond might just be one of the most hardworking people I've ever met. This man might be the definition of perseverance. Even though this was his only class that he was taking this semester, he was also working 60 hours a week every week and had a son to take care of. So as you can expect, he struggled quite a bit in this class, given both the difficulty of it and all the external factors facing him. He didn't do too well in the first exam either, so he was really stressing out. But thanks to our session, as well as his hard work and dedication, he would ultimately prevail in this class, which I'll get to later in the story time. The other member of our group was a girl named Mia. Mia was a rather shy but very nice and really brilliant girl. She usually paid more attention in class than me, so if our professor required different journal entries than what was in the book, I had her to rely on to let me know since I barely paid attention. I barely paid attention in class. She was also in my Intermediate Accounting 3 class, so during exam days, we'd usually sit beside each other since we had different seating arrangements on exam days. Anyways, that night, Wesley introduced me to Raymond and Mia. Pretty quickly, we became really cool with each other, and soon after just some basic talking and introducing ourselves, we got to work. Now what's really cool about the library is on the floor that we were on, there was a whiteboard with markers, so we pulled it over so we could write out examples. I was the one who used the whiteboard for the most part, as prior to this study session, I prepared quite a bit for this exam from studying on my own. This exam was on stock options, earnings per share, EPS, and accounting changes and errors. I especially was good at stock options, which ironically bored me to death in class, but somehow I randomly started finding it interesting, and all of a sudden, it was my strongest topic in the class and I became a god at stock options. My point was only made further on the second tax exam, which happened to have stock options on it too and the tax implications for them. I'll talk about that exam when we get to November. But anyways, Mia revealed to us that in addition to the homeworks, our professor also had 2 practice sets for each chapter, a multiple choice set and a problem set. Therefore, during our session, we decided to do the practice problem set for the chapter that includes stock options and EPS. I used the whiteboard and thoroughly explained each example from the practice and how to approach each one, which is basically like what I did while tutoring. I also used the self-check feature that the practices had to make sure I was correct, and I probably need to drink some water. I don't know what happened, my throat literally just it's like my throat just cut off out of nowhere. Okay, I drank some water, I'm a little more refreshed now. And I think it's safe to say that I did a very good, okay, yeah, I'm not at the right place. Anyways. And I think it's safe to say that I did a very good job explaining the material, as Wesley, Raymond, and Mio all said that at the end of the session, they felt better about the exam and understood the material much better. And on the exams, they proved that by making higher exam scores than the first one. Even though that almost always happens as the first exam is the toughest, seeing that improvement definitely made me more confident that I did a good job demonstrating the material and helping them out. Speaking of which, let's talk about how the exam went for me, because man was it so much easier than the first exam. Not only did I know what to expect and understood how my professor did things, but I also felt that I knew the material much better, especially after teaching it to my study group the night before. As a tutor, I can confirm that if you could teach someone material, then you truly understand and have a concept mastered. Like, I noticed this especially in business calc when I'm comparing how I tutored it at the beginning of 2023 to now. At the beginning of the year, while I understood the class well, there were a couple things I didn't quite get, but now that I had been tutoring that class for a year, I know absolutely everything about the class and demonstrated that in a big review session I'll introduce in a bit. And because I knew the material so well, I ended up finishing the exam on time, albeit only a couple minutes before time was up, but I clearly showed a good understanding of the material. Then a few days later, grades were released, so I got online to check and saw a big fat 98.5 on my grade for the test, a massive 26.5 point improvement from my previous exam. I was really happy about this exam grade, given that not only was it needed after doing so poorly on my first exam, but also was the highest exam grade I ever made out of every Intermediate Accounting 1, 2, and 3 exam I've taken, surpassing my third exam from Intermediate Accounting 1 to claim that title. As for why I did so well, the answer was quite obvious. I had a study group. Studying with others is a lot easier to do than studying by yourself. Since not only do you have others to walk you through the problem or ask questions to, but it also motivates you to study harder and understand the material better, as was in my case. Even though I normally study by myself since I'm more of an introvert and can study at my own pace, I think studying in groups is more effective, and I think that this coming this semester, specifically for auditing, I'm probably going to find a study group. I'll actually be taking that class with Mio, so I'll probably study with her again for that class since I've heard it's challenging. Also in October regarding academics was a project I did for tax. That would be our data analytics project. For this project, we were each given a state and we basically had to research how the Tax Cuts and Job Act of 2017 affected itemized deductions for our respective state. We were provided with instructions for each single step, so this is not a hard project at all. Anyways, the state I was assigned was Hawaii. So for it, I basically got to use Excel and Alteryx in order to create data regarding Hawaii taxpayer behavior and how this all affected Hawaiians of different brackets. It was overall a really fun project since the steps were very detailed and showed you exactly what to do, unlike the SUA where the instructions were extremely vague and unclear. It was also cool seeing how this important law affected taxpayers from all kinds of different brackets and seeing the implications of it. Then once that was done, we had to write a 250-word report on our findings and explain the impacts of the law. I did this in report pretty easily, even going as far as using statistics to perform a linear regression on the brackets, and then taking the derivative of my line of best fit to calculate the rate of change of the percentage of taxpayers within a bracket who itemize their deductions. Overall, this project was pretty fun, and I ended up making a 100 on it, so it was definitely a pretty successful project. Finally, to wrap up October, let's talk about that big review session I just mentioned that I would do for business calc. So if you saw Storytime 51, then you might recall that at the end of my 3rd semester, I held a review session for Principles of Accounting 1 on reading day to help students review for their final. Well, this semester, after seeing the success I had with this session the semester before, I decided to host one again, but this time, I decided to apply to host one for Business Calc. Of course, being an established tutor, you could probably guess that I was selected to hold the review session for it. Unlike the accounting one, which was a complete surprise since I was also competing against more experienced tutors for that role. But this semester, I guess not many tutors wanted to do sessions, so I easily got this role. Anyways, this session would work the same way as the accounting one, where I would create a review packet including all the material covered throughout the class, and then I would go over problems from the packet during the session. I talk more about this session and preparing for it when I discuss November, but in this month, all that really happened was that I was selected to host it. And with that, October comes to a close. While nowhere near as eventful as September, it was still a good month with a lot going for it. So now let's talk about November. This month will have a little more going on. To start, let's talk about swimming. So this month, I swam the remaining 2 events I had not swum yet, those being the 1000 freestyle and the 1650 freestyle, which I'll just simply call the mile. Now, you could probably see why these were the last events I went for, as they were far longer than any swim I had ever swum up to that point. In fact, back in October when I swam the 500 freestyle, my arms were so sore that I was so tired that I could barely even walk after swimming. However, over the course of a month and a half, I managed to build up quite a bit of endurance to where I knew that I was capable of swimming the 1000. So on November 20th, I decided to swim a 1000 for the first time, and wow, was it so much easier to swim than the 500 a month before, as while my arms got tired around the 300 mark, I began to overcome the soreness in them once I hit the 500 mark. In fact, the second half of the swim was even easier than the first half, as at that point, I was swimming at a steady pace and the only thing somewhat sore was my stomach, and it wasn't a painful sore, but rather an oh yeah kind of sore, the kind of soreness you get when you work your chest to the area to build abs. Ultimately, I would finish my swim in 17 minutes and 55 seconds, averaging about 27 seconds per lap. Even though I'm 100% a sprinter, I did at least have quite a bit of fun swimming an event as long as this, given that it wasn't as intense or as stressful as what I'm usually doing with 50s. In fact, I felt so good about this event that I decided the following day I was going to swim the mile, so that's what I did. And it too was quite fun, especially since despite going pretty slowly, I was still going faster than any other swimmer in the other lanes, which is pretty hilarious to think about. I managed to swim it in 28 minutes and 4 seconds. That meant that I had actually swum better on it than my 1000, as I averaged only about 1 minute and 42 seconds per 100, or about 25.5 seconds per lap, which is much faster than my 1000 speed. The reason that this was during the 1000, I managed to get in the groove of long distance pacing, and thanks to what I learned, I was able to apply that to the mile. And with that, I had successfully done every single event, from the ones I really enjoy and want to get better at, like the 50 and 100 freestyle, as well as the 50 butterfly, to the events I hate for the life of me, like the 200 butterfly and 400 IM. I had now completed every event, which felt super nice. November was also a great month for new personal bests. I had got a total of 6 new personal bests, those being in the 200 breaststroke, 100 IM, 100 butterfly, 50 butterfly, 50 breaststroke, and 200 freestyle. In the 200 breaststroke, I managed to beat my personal best, originally a time of 3 minutes and 40 seconds set back in October of 2017, by exactly 1 second, giving me a new best of 3 minutes and 39 seconds. This is a tough event because although I've gotten better at breaststroke, I've completely forgotten just how challenging a 200 of it can be. While not as bad as the 200 backstroke or 200 butterfly, it's still a tough event just because breaststroke, when done fast, takes a ton of energy, but I was still satisfied with dropping just a single second, since this is really a tough event. As for the 100 IM, I managed to get a time of 1 minute and 24 seconds, which was a 6-second improvement over my previous personal best back in October of 2017 of 1 minute and 30 seconds. I honestly could do a lot better on this event since I went way too fast on the butterfly portion, which is hard to control since I love butterfly and I especially like going fast in it, but because I went so quickly, that made the rest of the event tough. But I pulled through and still beat my time by a whole 6 seconds, so I can't complain. As for the 100 butterfly, oh my god, this event brings back so many horrible memories back from when I used to swim competitively. This was always my least favorite event back when I was 13 because my coach, who knew how much I hated it, always placed me in it, and every time I swam it, I would get disqualified. but now that I was a lot better with endurance and butterfly and was way better in the stroke in general, I took it on again and was nowhere near as bad as I remember it being back in 2017 and 2018. In fact, I managed to beat my personal best by an entire 9 seconds, giving me a new personal best of 1 minute and 31 seconds, compared to my previous one of 1 minute and 40 seconds set back in March of 2018. This is an event that I have high priority to focus on too, as there's so much room for improvement on this event that I'm also motivated to do it now that it's no longer as bad as it used to be. Staying on the topic of butterfly, the next day, I decided to take a shot at the 50 butterfly. This is my second most recent best prior to getting back into competitive swimming that August, as I set this personal best of 35 seconds back in July of 2021. However, that didn't stop me from beating it by 2 seconds, giving me a new personal best of 33 seconds. Like the 100 butterfly, I also saw a ton of potential in it, and in December, I'll go for it again and lower it even more since the 50 butterfly is also one of my favorite events in swimming. But before I get too ahead of myself, let's talk about yet another personal best that I set literally just 3 minutes after swimming the 50 butterfly. That would be the 50 breaststroke. Like the 50 butterfly, it too was a pretty recent personal best, that being a time of 42 seconds set back in July of 2021. I managed to beat it by about 1.5 seconds, giving me a time of a little under 41 seconds. I could probably easily bring it lower than 40 seconds by doing it individually rather than right after another personal best, but I guess we'll just have to wait for me to swim it this coming semester. Then the last personal best I set in November was the 200 freestyle. This has always been one of my least favorite events because it's just too long to be considered a sprint event, but yet too short to be a distance event, so determining what speed to go at is always confusing. And that's what happened during the swim, as I was super confused throughout the whole time I swam it about what speed I should be going. And that messed me up quite a bit, as I was so tired by the time that I finished the first 100, but still didn't stop me from beating my personal best by an entire 12 seconds, giving me a new time of 2 minutes and 43 seconds, compared to my previous personal best of 2 minutes and 55 seconds set back in March of 2018. So yeah, I did really well with swimming this month. For now, let's talk about academics. More specifically, let's talk about exams. So, the first exam I took this month was my second exam for tax. This test was on gross income, so basically what it all is considered gross income, not a part of gross income or capital gains, which includes things like short-term and long-term investments, rental or leased appliances, winnings from civil lawsuits or lottery, and my personal favorite, stock options. Yep, we also went over stock options and taxes as well. Although instead of focusing on the financial reporting side like in Intermediate Accounting 3, we focused more on tax burden from stock options and when to classify them as ordinary or income or capital gains. Since I was already super good with stock options from Intermediate Accounting 3, you can understand why this was my favorite thing and this was on the exam, and see that I did pretty well with it. In fact, by the time I finished this exam, me, Raymond, and Mio always joked that I was a god at 3 things: statistics, taxes, and stock options, just because I'm so good with stock options. The test also included above and below the line deductions, when to take itemized deductions or when to take the standard deduction, and tax credits, so you could see why it was a more difficult exam than the first exam, which was simply on different tax rates, how to calculate taxes, the different filing statuses, and other basic stuff. Anyways, I took this exam on Monday, November 6th, and I kinda have to agree with my professor that it was tougher than the first exam, as it was pretty tough. However, I ended up doing very well on it, making a 99 on this exam. Unfortunately, while not the highest grade in the class like the first exam, it was still super high, especially since the class average was in the 60s. But I wasn't done with the exams just yet, as literally the next day, I had yet another exam, that exam being for AIS. So the second exam was basically on the SUA as a whole, the different things we did in it, and how we recorded different entries and stuff. Speaking of which, the SUA completely kicked my ass in October. I got pretty far into it, doing all the transactions. However, that's not all the project, as there's also month-end entries that you'd have to do and year-end entries in order to prepare the financial statements. These were all far worse than the transactions for December, because although there were directions, they were far more unclear than the directions for the transactions, and also involved us literally having to use blank sheets of paper to do things like bank reconciliations and other stuff I had never seen before. Our professor did an example of bank reconciliations in class, but I felt like the one in the SUA was nothing like what he did in the class, and it was just overall very messy. It would also ultimately be the bank reconciliations that made me do something that I very rarely do with regards to schoolwork: give up. Yep, you heard me right. I decided to give up on the SUA. I put far more time into it than almost any other project I had ever done, and I felt like I wasn't getting anything in return for it. I also just felt like a complete waste of time anyway, since this is a paper and pencil one in practice. We use accounting systems and ERP networks to automate these processes. Since I already had 65% of the project done, I decided that I had enough, and so I gave up right there. And let's just say that for the next month, I felt really guilty about it since I never gave up on projects. But considering just how crazy this project made me go and how much time it was requiring of me, I decided that giving up on it was the best decision. And sure enough, it certainly was, as I still managed to make a 60 on the project, which was doable, which is double what I anticipated. Additionally, I also got a breathe of massive sigh of relief when I turned into SUA. Finally, turning that son of a bitch in was one of the greatest feelings in the world, given how much stress and anxiety that little fucker caused me over the past month and a half, so being done with it felt absolutely amazing. Anyways, getting back to the exam, you would think that it would be super hard, given that it was based on the SUA, and while it was probably the hardest exam in the class, it was still pretty easy since a lot of the questions were stuff I knew from Intermediate Accounting 1 and 2, as well as pretty obvious questions. Like one question literally asked what a periodic inventory system is, since that's the system Warren Sports Supply used, so a lot of questions were pretty basic and easy, and thanks to that, I managed to make an 88 on it despite not doing too well on the SUA. And after the second exam, we finally moved back into actual course content, similar to what we did at the beginning of the class for exam 1, which felt absolutely amazing after going through the dreaded SUA for the past month and a half. Honestly, if the department just took out the SUA, this class would be by far the easiest class in the whole accounting curriculum, even easier than Principles Accounting 1 and 2 as well as tax. And plus, the SUA barely taught me anything since it just felt like a complete waste of time. Like I learned 100 times more from the Excel, Alteryx, and SAP projects from the SUA. I'll talk about the Alteryx and SAP projects later. For now, I want to stick to the topic of exams and talk about my fourth exam for Principles of Accounting 2, which I took on Wednesday, November 15th. So this was by far the most difficult exam in the class. Not only was the material pretty challenging, but the exam itself was honestly felt unfair and felt nothing like what we learned in class, even after mentoring a student, who was not one of the 2 students I mentored back in October. I still found myself struggling with this exam since it asked different questions than what I saw on the homeworks and exam prep practice. I still came out with an 83, but it was still by far one of the most frustrating exams I ever took. Good thing that the final wouldn't be as bad, as the only bad thing about it was just simply waking up for it, which I'll touch on what I mean by that when we get to December. Anyways, the last exam I took this month was my third exam for Intermediate Accounting 3. This was definitely the hardest exam material-wise in the class, as it was on statements of cash flows and leases. Personally, I think the first exam was harder since it was on the first exam of the course, but I can see why a lot of people struggled on this exam, as both of these topics are not easy at all. However, even though I didn't get good at them as much as I did with stock options, I still managed to get pretty good with leases, understanding the journal entries involved, and identifying whether or not a lease is a finance lease or an operating lease. And as you might expect, I was able to use my knowledge of leases to help my study group. Wesley would no longer join us since he had to work, so the study groups were shortened to just me, Raymond, and Mio. So the day before the exam, I helped the 2 out with leases and how to record the entries for them. Overall, it went pretty well, especially since I found leases far easier than what most people think, as it's universally considered one of the toughest accounting topics to understand, which baffles me a little bit since I don't think they're that complicated. And it seems like Raymond and Mio agreed with me by the end of the session since they began to understand leases way better. However, while leases were not that bad, statement of cash flows was a different story. Now, the majority of it is pretty easy, since it's just identifying what constitutes an operating, investing, or financing activity, as well as determining how much of cash flows from a particular transaction you have, which I found super easy and efficient from drawing T accounts. However, what completely screwed me up on this chapter was actually creating statements of cash flows. So the third part in this chapter was actually creating a statement of cash flows for all 3 sections, and I literally have no idea how they work. Like, we did have a homework for this, and not only was this homework by far the longest homework out of every intermediate accounting chapter, but it barely made any sense and just didn't explain a single step. In fact, I didn't even do that homework just because barely any of it made any sense and I couldn't find any help for it whatsoever. And it seems like everyone else had the same thoughts as me regarding it. Like, not even half of all students from all sections of the course completed the homework, and the ones that did spend on average 5 hours on it, with most homework usually only took an hour to an hour and a half. In fact, Mio even knew someone who spent over 8 hours on it. That's how absolutely ridiculous that homework was. During our session, we 3 also tried to look into it, but none of us could understand it, so all hope was lost there. Then the next day, being Thursday, November 16th, we took the exam. Despite being a difficult exam, it ended up being way easier than I expected. The multiple choice section was especially easy, as it was probably the easiest multiple choice section of any intermediate accounting exam I ever took between this class, Intermediate Accounting 1, and Intermediate Accounting 2. Like, almost every question felt like it directly came off the practice multiple choice sets, and was just super easy to get through. I even finished the multiple choice section in less than 15 minutes. It was that easy. The problems though were a little tougher, so we had 3 problems: a finance lease problem, an operating lease problem, and a statement of cash flows problem. The finance lease problem was super easy, so I'm really good with them. However, the operating lease problem was a bit of a challenge, so there were some information I had never been given before on operating lease problems, so it was pretty tough. But the statement of cash flow problem was a problem asking me to prepare the operating section of a statement of cash flows. Since I had no idea how to do it, I skipped that question, taking 18 points off my grade. Yeah, that one problem was worth 18 points. At least the exam had 110 possible points, so that meant that the highest grade I could make was a 92 on the exam. And surprisingly enough, I actually got really close to that score, as I ended up making an 87 on this exam. I managed to get every single multiple choice question correct, which while I could see that being the case, it still shocked me since there was one question that I wasn't too sure about. And then I got the finance lease problem 100% correct and got partial credit for the operating lease problem, since I at least knew what I was doing on it for the most part. And then of course I got no points on the statement of cash flows problem. So yeah, I managed to do a lot better than I anticipated thanks to the exam having a super easy multiple choice section. But even better than my success from this exam was Raymond. Raymond, who at this point was likely looking at failing the class, managed to pull through and made a whopping 82 on the exam despite not doing too well on the first and second exams. Even though I don't want to give myself credit, as this was 100% because Raymond knew the material, I will say that I think he did great because of our group sessions. After the session, I could tell that Raymond knew leases way better than that he did prior to the session. He showed a clear understanding of the material and was able to demonstrate that understanding on the exam, so he was very successful. In fact, I was honestly more happy for him than I was for myself, as this 82 was absolutely what he needed to pass, and the best part was that this would carry forward to the final. So when we get there, I'll talk about Raymond's massive redemption and how he managed to show more perseverance than I think I've ever seen from anyone. So that's how exams went for this month. Now let's talk about some projects, as I had projects for Intermediate Accounting 3, AIS, and Tax. Since I just talked about it, let's discuss the project for Intermediate Accounting 3. So this was a 3-part project where we had to dig into a company's financial statements and answer a series of questions in an Excel document. The first part involved basic information about the company, its income statement data, and balance sheet data, and we had to calculate financial ratios. Then the second and third parts followed the course material, where in the second part, we looked at the company's statement of stockholders' equity, earnings per share and stock options, and accounting changes and errors. Then for the third part, we looked at the company's statement of cash flows, leases outstanding, and income taxes. For this month, I'll discuss the first 2 parts, and then for December, I'll talk about the third month. So, my assigned company was Coca-Cola. As someone whose favorite soda is Dr. Pepper, a Coke product, this made this project a little more enjoyable since I got to look into the details about the company that bottles my favorite drink. Anyways, the first part was by far the most tedious and confusing part. Being the first part of the project, I had practically no idea what I was doing, and my professor could clearly see that, so I only made an 80 on it. However, I did much better on the second part since my professor left some feedback for the first part, so I followed it and managed to score a 95 on the second part thanks to the feedback. The second part was also much easier to do as well since it wasn't as much information and was more readily available, unlike the first part where it wasn't. Also had projects for AIS. To start, I'll talk about the Ultrex project. So this project was pretty much went exactly like what the Excel project contained, as it was just a simple 8-part project where we watched a video from our professor explaining the steps, and we followed along and then took a quiz on each part. It went just as easily as the Excel project, landing me a full 100 on it. The other project, though, was a little more advanced, but it too was not that bad. That project being our SAP project. So once we finished the SUA, we got to learn about ERP systems and why they're so effective and important to large-scale business operations. By far the largest and most widely used ERP system is SAP. So for this project, we got to explore the system and look at all that was capable of. Anyways, unlike the Excel and Ultrex projects, the SAP project involved written instructions and exploring rather than just watching videos. Nonetheless, for the most part, the instructions for the project were very clearly written in a manner that's very easy to follow through. There were a couple issues I had, including one instance where I accidentally did a step twice, but that was okay because our grade wasn't about our finishing product, but rather from a quiz. So included in each step were a couple of multiple choice questions that our professor asked us to write down. I simply copy and pasted those questions onto a Word document, and then highlighted the correct answer for each one that I went through the project. Anyways, the quiz basically consisted of all the questions we wrote down, so it's basically just plugging your answers. There were a couple questions I was slightly unsure about since my results came back differently than what was intended, because I had done a step twice, but I simply reversed that step by debiting notes payable and crediting cash, since the business borrowed money. we were allowed 2 attempts on the quiz, so I was expecting to get a couple questions wrong and would have to go back into SAP to figure out what went wrong. But to my surprise, I managed to make 100 on the first try, proving that this project really was as straightforward as it was. So therefore, I got 100 on the SAP project. And I'm really happy with that too, as the SAP project was by far way better than that stupid SUA project, which is ironic because these 2 projects were almost identical to one another, just that we weren't dealing with war and sports supply in the SAP project, and we were of course using an ERP system rather than doing the bookkeeping by hand. I also learned far more from the SAP project too, since there wasn't so much thrown at me at once and the steps were very clear. But the best part, which also proves why ERP systems are so superior, is that it took far less time. I managed to complete the entire SAP project in just 3 hours, whereas that's how much I spent per night on the SUA project, which took a month and a half. The amount of convenience built into SAP and being able to do things automatically felt so much better, and I learned way more too, since I'll literally be using SAP on my job, since that's the ERP system my future company uses. The last project I want to discuss for November is the second tax project. So for it, we had to create a tax return for Homer and Marge Simpson. And yes, I'm talking about Homer and Marge Simpson from The Simpsons, with Bart and Lisa being counted as child dependents. So for it, we basically had to fill out all the IRS forms associated with filling out a tax return. So the Schedule 1040, Schedules A, B, and C, and Schedules 1, 2, and 3. We didn't have to fill out any more forms than that, just those ones. Anyways, this was a group project, so I got to work with 4 others in the class, which made the project much easier. Usually that's not the case, as I hate group work most of the time, but my group members were really cool and all pulled their weight. Anyways, this was actually quite a difficult project since there were quite a few questions that we were ambiguous on, specifically with regards to where we had placed state income taxes paid for itemized deductions. But at the very last minute, we managed to piece the remaining parts and print on the return. That's when probably the funniest thing regarding the project occurred. So I volunteered to take the return once printed and absolutely run as fast as I could to class, since we only had like 3 minutes left until class began, which was when the project was due, while everyone else came in late. So that's what we did. One member took my stuff with him to class while I took the return and absolutely bolted as fast as I could through the library, outside, and the class. By the time I got to class, I was absolutely out of breath. Although I'm used to swimming fast for extended periods of time, I'm not used to doing so for running. So when I entered the classroom and turned in the return to my professor, I was gasping for air, and everyone noticed too, as people were asking me if I was alright and stuff. In fact, my professor even made probably the best comment he could make. He said, "See, taxes will take your breath away." Me and everyone else then laughed as I excused myself to get some water. Soon afterwards, the rest of my group showed up, and me and the rest of the class then cheered them on for fun. The class also continued checking up on me throughout the class, since I was really exhausted. Needless to say that my class consisted of a lot of very friendly and super nice people, if I haven't made that clear enough. Of course, Mio was in this class too, so you know it's a super great class too with her. Ultimately, my group only made a 90 on this project, which actually surprised me a bit since I expected to only make an 80, but I guess after watching me run as fast as I could to his class, our professor probably gave us some extra credit for my performance, which if he did actually do that, I can't blame him one bit, as that was some serious dedication right there. So that's all the projects I had this month, as well as all that really happened academics-wise for the month of November. However, November was also an important month for work, so near the middle of the month, my boss gathered me and everyone else holding a reading day review session for a workshop to basically talk about the do's and don'ts of reading day and review sessions. Since this wasn't my first time doing one, it was mostly just stuff I already knew, so I kinda messed around with Evan, who was hosting the reading day session for college algebra. But like at orientation, our boss also used Poll Everywhere with someone decided to be funny on it. So one question she pulled up was, what should you not do during her session? I and most others put in some valid answers like not coming prepared, not answering questions, and other stuff. But that's when someone put in a joke answer, that being, call an attendee stupid. Our boss had a good laugh at it, and pretty soon, we all submitted joke entries, including one who submitted assault an attendee. I submitted one that said, talk about Fight Club, which also got a few laughs. It was a super hilarious moment that our boss cracked up too, so it was definitely the highlight of the workshop. Anyways, this would also mark when I began working on that review packet that I was going to use for the review session. I basically created a 40 multiple choice packet that included problems from all different concepts throughout the course, mostly of either easy to or medium difficulty since the final for business calc is super easy compared to the other exams. I also created step-by-step solutions to the packet, so I think the packet overall was very well written and a great resource to use for the review session, which I'll discuss when we get to December. Speaking of which, let's move on to December, since that wraps up all November, so we only have only a little bit to go now. December was a pretty crazy month, months, but I'll only be talking about the first half of the month in the story time since that's what's included in this semester. The second half of the month was Christmas break, which if I ever do an ERS series for college one day, I'll include it in the final part since I would include it as part of my last semester of college. Anyways, let's wrap up swimming for a bit. So obviously, I didn't get any new records since I completed the whole swimming roster in November, but I did get quite a few new personal bests. Those personal bests being the 100 backstroke, 200 backstroke, 200 IM, 1000 freestyle, 100 breaststroke, 50 butterfly, and the 100 freestyle. So for the 100 backstroke, I managed to get a new best of 1 minute and 37 seconds, a 7-second improvement from my previous personal best of 1 minute and 44 seconds set back in January of 2018. My splits for this event were absolutely hilarious, as I went way too fast on the first 50. I ended up doing the first 50 in about 36 seconds, which is actually faster than my 50 backstroke personal best, so I could technically consider that a new personal best, although I required myself to actually swim that event for it to count as a personal best. But then for the second 50 took a little over a minute, as I was so tired from the first 50. I think if I could work on pacing, I can easily get a new new best time on it. The next day, I went for the 200 backstroke, which happens to be my least favorite event because it's the 200 of my worst stroke and least favorite stroke. I managed to get a time of 3 minutes and 19 seconds, a 7-second improvement over my previous personal best of 3 minutes and 26 seconds, set back in November of 2018. I didn't go as fast on the first 50 like I did the 100 backstroke, but being a 200, this was absolute torture. Backstroke will never be fun for me, no matter how much better I get at it, which explains why I have such horrible times for it. But considering the only backstroke events I'm interested in are improving the 50 backstroke and 100 IM, I'm not all concerned about bringing this time down. The next day, I went for what historically was my favorite event, the 200 IM, well, with the exception of 50 free and 50 butterfly, that is. This is the event that I think I swam the most out of all the events I swam in meets back when I was swimming competitively when I was 13, as I recall swimming it at almost every meet I swam at. Therefore, I was expecting this to be a difficult time to bring down since 13-year-old me optimized it pretty well, but I ended up pulling through and managed to get a time of 3 minutes and 10 seconds, a 2-second improvement from my previous personal best of 3 minutes and 12 seconds set back in March of 2018. The same problem I had with my 100 IM occurred here, as I went way too fast on the 50 butterfly, to the point that I was too tired to go fast on the other strokes. I definitely need to work more on butterfly pacing, as I have a tendency to go too fast on it and use my energy up, which also explains why I love the 50 butterfly so much. The next personal best I got was on the 1000 freestyle, so after swimming the mile, I knew that I would only get better and better with endurance by swimming these events more often. So one day, I decided to swim another 1000, and thanks to all that I learned from swimming, it the first time in swimming the mile, I beat my personal best by an incredible minute and 19 seconds, giving me a new personal best of 16 minutes and 36 seconds. Averaging me about a minute and 40 seconds per 100. And what's even crazier is that I knew that this time could go down even further, so I plan to work on it this upcoming semester and bring it down further since I've come to really enjoy the 1000. I don't think I'm ready to fully practice the mile, but maybe one day whenever I've gotten really good at the 1000, I'll put more practice into the mile. Now that we've reached the final personal best set back in 2018, that being the 100 breaststroke. However, I took this event on the way differently than previous personal best. Rather than swimming and beating it, I instead disproved that this time was even legit by using statistics, and with 99.99997% confidence, 5 standard deviations from the mean, I concluded that the 100 breaststroke time I set back in January of 2018 was mistimed. It was timed at 1 minute and 26 seconds, but after looking at my historical average, I concluded that there was no way that time was legit, as it was 9 seconds faster than my second fastest 100 breaststroke that I swam 10 months later. So I can say that the 100 breaststroke time swam back in January of 2018 was illegitimate. Therefore, my actual personal best was a time of 1 minute and 35 seconds set back in November of 2018, which I beat by 3 seconds, giving me a time of 1 minute and 32 seconds. And with that, I had officially beat all of my personal bests, from my earliest one set back in March of 2017 when I was 12 years old, to my latest one that I set in July of 2022 when I was 18 years old. It was a super satisfying feeling and had been my goal since I got back into swimming, and after 4 months of hard work, I'd finally done it. But I was not done there, as I wanted to continue swimming and get better and better, so that's what I decided to do. So the next personal best I got was in the 50 butterfly. I beat it by about half a second, giving me a new time of 32.71 seconds. But the final personal best is one for the books, that being the 100 freestyle. The 100 freestyle has always been a very special event for me, as every time I swam it, I got a new personal best. I always had a goal for it that I set when I was 12, and that was to swim it in under a minute. I also did the same with a 50 freestyle, as I aimed to swim it in under 30 seconds, which I achieved back in November of 2018. However, this was more of a distant and unbelievable goal, considering the time I got when I swam it at my first meet was a minute and 35 seconds. But over time, it became more and more achievable, especially with me getting a minute and 18 seconds at the end of 2017, and then a minute 15 seconds at the end of 2018. Then in September of 2023, I had course time my warm-up and managed to get a minute 14 easily, which proved that I was more than capable of bringing this time really low. And by really low, I mean a full 10 seconds, as I managed to drop my time all the way down to a minute and 4 seconds. Yeah, I had a fantastic swim. I actually went a little faster on the second 50 and took advantage of me being at full energy for the first 50 by going a little slower, which proved to work super well. Then just a few days later, after practicing the event some, I decided to take another shot at it, and I managed to beat my time by only 140 milliseconds, giving me a new time of a minute and 3.98 seconds. This was actually a super sloppy personal best, as not only did I go too fast in the first 50, but I also didn't even do a flip turn on the last wall. This only proved to me more that I could bring this down further by just fixing my technique, and pretty soon I'll achieve my 7-year goal of a sub 1 minute 100 freestyle. So that's all that happened with regards to swimming for the month. Since I moved back into college just a couple days ago, I've been swimming more and more, hoping to one day pull off the sub minute 100 freestyle. It'll take a lot of work, but I think I could do it maybe even by the end of this year. So I'm so close to beating it. But I know that these last few seconds will be the hardest seconds to drop, so I'll be trying my very best to bring it down. So now with that being only like a week of classes before reading day and final exams for this month, I won't have a lot to discuss. However, I do want to mention the last part of Intermediate Accounting 3 project. So it was on the last 3 chapters of the class, so statement of cash flows, leases, and accounting for income taxes. Most things were super easy to find, although leases were a little bit of a pain in the ass because Coca-Cola's financial statements don't really offer that much information on leases, as all they really say is that they have operating leases outstanding, but don't provide interest rates or interest payable or amortization or anything else associated with leases. But I still managed to get all the information I needed since I knew exactly what I was doing, and this was by far the shortest of the 3 parts of the project. I also made 100 on it, so it was certainly the easiest of the 3 parts. And with that, all of my schoolwork and other assignments for all my classes were finished, leaving only final exams left. My last day of classes was on Wednesday, December 6th. But on top of being my last day of classes, it was also my last day of tutoring for the semester. That night was drop-in night, to which I was expecting quite a bit of people for statistics since their final was that Friday. And I was right, as I had 5 people show up. In fact, I even connected 2 tables together so I'd be able to get everyone in one group. Thankfully, nobody for business calc came, so I was able to keep everyone on the same page. All 5 of the attendees had practice exams too, so we decided to work through problems in those, and I managed to help them all prepare for their final. Overall, this was probably my best drop-in tutoring performance, as I did very well. And then the next day rolled around. This was reading day, a day between the last day of classes and finals. For every semester that I've attended college, it's been a very important day. It was important my first semester since that was the day that my crush at the time messaged me on GroupMe, giving me her number, and then we called for an hour. Unfortunately, we didn't get past classes, but it was fun while it lasted. Then my second semester, that was the day I left my job at the bookstore in order to pursue tutoring. Then my third semester, I held the review session for Principles of Accounting 1. And then for this semester, I also held a review session but for Business Calc. So that's what I'll be discussing now. So as I said already, I've prepared quite a bit for the session, since I wanted to be as prepared as possible. Even though I knew all the answers to my packet and knew literally everything about the class, I still wanted to prepare myself quite a bit for the session since I would be presenting in front of roughly 40 people. As for the actual session, it overall went super well. I didn't go over the whole packet, I just took a survey of what my audience wanted to go over and focus on those topics specifically. I think everyone who attended overall got a much better understanding and felt much better about their exam, especially since I went over the more tougher topics in the class like business applications, integrals, and graph features. Many of my tutees I helped throughout the semester also attended, so it made me feel better knowing that I had done my job well enough that throughout the semester that my tutees returned for one last review session. So that too gave me a confidence boost. And overall, I did pretty good. Since this was not my first reading day review session, there isn't a whole lot to talk about since it overall went pretty well and overall. I was nowhere near as nervous as it was for the accounting one back in the spring semester, and overall, it was a lot easier and to prepare for and do since I was used to the format and knew what to expect. It wasn't nearly as interactive as my accounting one, but considering it's a little more challenging to do that for calculus than it is for accounting, I don't think it's much of an issue. Time also went by super quickly during the session, mostly since I had quite a bit of fun doing this session and definitely enjoyed myself doing it. However, that's when something pretty funny that happened midway through the session. So the way that I did this session was that we were in a lecture hall and I was sitting at the professor's desk with the projector and doing the problems by hand. However, I decided to take a little stretch after finishing a problem, so I did that. But in doing so, I ended up kicking something underneath where my feet rested. I then said, I think I just kicked something, to which everyone began laughing. So I went underneath the desk to pick up what I kicked, to which I discovered a random ceramic mug just lying there on the ground. I then got up and held the mug held up like a trophy, where about everyone was dying laughing. I then said, it had to have been a sociology professor who left this mug down here, to which everyone laughed some more and so did I. I then set the mug down and left it there, wondering what kind of professor would leave a mug in a spot that's easy to kick. Afterwards, the session resumed back to the material, but at least it was definitely the biggest highlight of the session, as I certainly didn't expect to kick a mug midway through the session. So yeah, pretty successful reading day review session. This semester for my last reading day review session, I'm planning to do one for statistics, just to give myself something different again. I'll of course discuss it when I do my story time on my last semester of college, which I'll probably write and release in June. Then the following day, that being Friday, December 8th, was my last day of work for the semester. For it, the tutoring department hosted an end-of-year celebration for all tutors, peer assistant leaders, peer mentors, and other employees in our field for an end-of-year celebration. It was a fun little party where we ate lunch, cracked jokes, and got to catch up with fellow employees, and was overall a blast. Finally, that brings me to finals. So the way finals at my school work is that rather than taking them on the last day of class or whatnot, my school creates a schedule for what day your final will be, what time it will be, and what room it will be in. They release a final exam calendar every year, so I used it to see when my finals would be. And let's just say that this semester, I got fucked up in the ass hard by my final exam schedule, as I had by far some of the most ridiculous and completely bullshit ass times for my finals. Let's start with by far the worst time I had for a final, that being my final for Principles of Accounting 2. So this class, as stated earlier in the story time, met on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from 10:10 to 11 a.m. However, the final for it was quite possibly the worst, craziest, and most obnoxious time that the school could have set for a final. So some classes have common finals, which are finals created by the department the class is in. Principles of Accounting 1 and 2 are both common final classes, so their finals are created and administered by the accounting department. So to accommodate this, the academic affairs had to create a special time for our exam. And by a special time, I mean they decided to make this final take place on Saturday, December 9th at 8 a.m. Yup, 8 in the morning on a fucking Saturday. What kind of piece of shit creates the final schedule and thinks that a Saturday out of all days is the best day, much less at 8 a.m. as well? Thankfully, this exam was only on the last two chapters, and I only needed a 41 to maintain an A in the class. But still, Saturday at 8 a.m. is absolutely atrocious. Like, they could have made the final be at 3 a.m., and they would still been a better time. Honestly, I think my school should start offering late night classes, like classes past midnight, as they probably have higher attendance than morning classes. But nonetheless, I still managed to fail through the exam, making a 95 on it despite only studying for like 10 minutes, giving me a 96.52 in the class and a super easy A. In fact, the exam itself was not that bad. It was waking up for it, as that was the second hardest thing that morning. If your mind's dirty enough, you probably know what the hardest thing was, so I ain't gonna discuss it here. But at least once I finished that exam, I was done with Principles of Accounting 2 and could focus on my other 3 classes. The next exam I took was for tax, which I took on Monday, December 11th at 2 o'clock. This was by far the most fairly scheduled exam, as it wasn't right on top of another exam or on a Saturday morning, so I'd personally say this was by far my easiest exam just because of that. Anyways, this exam, like the Principles of Accounting 2 exam, was only on the last third of the class, so I didn't have to go back and rememorize the differences between being single with a dependent or being head of household. This exam was on business expenses and deductions for them. So things like business meals, business trips, maker's depreciation, that stuff. Honestly, I never managed to understand this material as well as I did the other concepts in this class, but I still managed to do really well in the final. I didn't have to do too well on it either, as I only needed a 37 to maintain an A in the class. But despite that, I still came out with a 96 on it despite only studying for like an hour. That's finished me off with the class with a 97.5, which overtook statistics as the highest grade I've ever made in a class throughout my time in college. Funny how it ended up being in a 4,000 level class, which is supposed to be harder than 3,000 level classes, but considering this is what I'll be doing when I graduate, it makes perfect sense as to why I did so well in this class. Then after that, I had a couple of days to prepare for my AIS and Intermediate Accounting 3 exams. The night after taking the tax final, I met up with Raymond and Mio again to study for the Intermediate Accounting 3 exam, as Raymond had his that Tuesday. I mentioned how well he did once I finished talking about my results for the exam. Not too sure about Mio, but I'm sure she did really well too since she's really smart. Anyways, between my tax final and my last 2 finals, I didn't really do a lot of studying, and the studying I did was more geared towards Intermediate Accounting 3, as I was a little more concerned about it since it was comprehensive, unlike AIS, which was just on the last unit. But then pretty soon, Thursday, December 14th arrived, meaning it was time to not only take my last 2 finals, but also wrap up my second to last semester of college. And again, academic affairs got me screwed up with the final exam schedules. So for one, they assigned me 2 finals, but then assigned them back to back. So I had my AIS final at 8 AM, and then my Intermediate Accounting 3 exam immediately afterwards at 11. I wish the AIS final was moved back to Tuesday, as that would have worked a lot better. But I mean, I'd rather take 2 finals back to back rather than take a Saturday morning final, so I can't complain too much. Let's start with the AIS final. So this was probably the easiest exam in the class, as the last unit was easier than the first unit, even for someone who's already taken MIS. Again, every question was taken directly off the class notes, so if you simply practiced and knew the notes, you were good. Since I only studied for 5 minutes for this exam, I didn't do too well on it, but I still did good on it and made a 78 on it. That gave me an 88.04 for my final grade in the class. Even though I had to settle for a B after the SUA, I really didn't mind just because that project screwed me up that much, so I'm glad and happy to be done with the class period. Besides, that's all I wanted in this class anyways, and I only needed a 25 to keep that grade, and I did just that. Then a couple of hours later, I took the final for Intermediate Accounting 3. Again, Mio sat beside me and we talked for a little while before the exam, just getting each other ready for it. And then, the exam began. Now, unlike the other exams I took this semester, this exam was comprehensive, so it ranged from stockholders' equity to stock options to leases to the dreaded cash flow statements all the way to income taxes. However, it was more weighted on accounting for income taxes since it was the last chapter in the class and we had not yet been tested on it. Similar to how the finals worked for Intermediate Accounting 1 and 2, where the finals were comprehensive but leaned more heavily on the last chapter of the course. Anyways, the income tax chapter was by far the most unusual chapter I think we ever did in all of Intermediate Accounting. The first half of the chapter was really easy to understand and I mastered it with no problem. However, the second half was some of the most confusing and wildest bullshit ever. Nothing whatsoever seemed to have made any sense from it since everything was super inconsistent. Like income tax payable, which is usually calculated by multiplying taxable income by the tax rate, would sometimes be a plug-in credit value and other times it would be calculated using the formula. I don't know, it was just so inconsistent with every problem from the second half of the chapter. At least I managed to make an 80 on the income taxes multiple choice practice set, so that made me feel a little better about the exam. And overall, this exam wasn't all that bad. Well, the multiple choice section wasn't, which took up the vast majority of the exam. Time was not an issue either, since we were given 2.5 hours to take this final compared to the hour and 15 minutes we were allotted for normal exams. So that wasn't an issue. But what was an issue were the problems. So there were 4 problems. The first 2 came from the income tax chapter, which scared me a little bit until I realized that the first problem came from the first part of the chapter, which I completely mastered. So I did it super easily. The second problem though was from the second half of the chapter, meaning I wouldn't get full credit. But at least I would kind of show that I at least knew what I was doing despite not doing it correctly, so I was able to do it for partial credit. Then the third and fourth problems were not from the income tax chapter. The first problem was probably the best problem I could have asked for, a stock options problem. I was and still am an absolute god at stock options, so I went in there and easily recorded the entries for it. However, the fourth problem was literally the worst problem I could have asked for, preparing a statement of cash flows. The same type of problem that was found on the most confusing and obnoxiously long homework assignment, and the only problem I skipped on the third exam was on the final. Albeit it wasn't worth as many points, but I was not excited in the slightest to see it on the final. However, since I never managed to learn it, I figured I would skip it too. So instead of preparing the statement, I just wrote the word no, and completely skipped the problem. My professor had a good sense of humor, so he probably found it funny. And plus, it wasn't like I could actually solve the problem anyway, since I didn't even know the first step to creating a statement of cash flows. So that's the best I could have done and answered the problem with. But after checking over my work, I then handed the final to my professor, grabbed my stuff, and headed out the classroom to wrap up my last final of the semester. I ultimately made an 80 on the final for that class, which was more than enough since I only needed a 45 to maintain a B in the class. This gave me an 86.64 for the class, which I was more than satisfied with given that this was by far the hardest class I've ever taken in college. It was far more difficult than Intermediate Accounting 1 and 2 and econometrics, all 3 of which were previously tied for the hardest classes I've taken in college. Intermediate Accounting 3 also holds the title of being the second hardest class I've ever taken, with Algebra 1 back in 8th grade still taking the cake for the hardest class I've ever taken in my whole academic career. So it was pretty damn nice to have this class finished with. It also means that I'm done with every intermediate accounting class. For any non-accounting majors who watching this story time, the intermediate accounting classes are pretty much like our weed-out classes. Principles Accounting 1 and 2, which are the classes all business majors take, are simple bookkeeping and decision-making classes. Intermediate accounting, on the other hand, is actual accounting, so dealing with journal entries, recording transactions, accruals, estimating, financial reporting, depreciating land, all of it. Well, maybe not depreciating land since you can't do that, but you get the point. You can consider these classes like the weed-out classes for accounting majors, as they're somewhat designed in that manner. But now that I'm done with all the three of them, things hopefully won't be as hard next semester, so I can finally relax. And with that, my 4th semester was wrapped up. I stayed on campus for a little while longer, mostly just to stay around and relax. Then that Sunday, December 17th, I packed my stuff up and went home for the holidays. So yeah, that's my 4th semester of college. This has definitely been my craziest semester by far, from landing a full-time job for the next summer, to getting back into swimming, to tutoring almost double the amount that I tutored last spring, to wrapping up my second to last semester of college. I had an absolutely wild semester. Though that's okay, as it was definitely the good kind of wild. The one that's exciting and had a lot of great things happen. I think it's safe to say that this was also my best semester of college yet, just because of all the great things and accomplishments this semester included. It was by far the least stressful semester since I of course managed to land the job, and have since relaxed a ton. I made a ton of friends this semester, and overall, it was fun. Speaking of friends, let's talk about Raymond one last time. So after all of his hard work, dedication, and perseverance, Raymond managed to make a satisfying grade on his final, meaning he managed to pass Intermediate Accounting 3. I don't think I've ever been so proud of someone as I was for Raymond, as I saw him work his ass off throughout the semester trying to persevere through this godforsaken class. But he was successful and he was able to pass the class, and just like my reaction to the third exam, I was even more happy for him than I was for myself, as while the stakes for me were low, they were really high for Raymond. But he pulled through and succeeded. So Raymond, if you're watching this, absolutely fantastic job in Intermediate Accounting 3. And I'll try to help you out as much as I can in AIS this coming semester, since I know you're taking it this semester. That then brings me to the last part of the story time, that being this coming semester. So if I haven't made myself clear already, this coming semester that I'll be starting this next week will be my final semester of college. I'll be graduating in May, which is super exciting to think about as I'm ready to be done with school. As for the classes that I'll be taking this semester, well, I'll be taking 5 classes. Those classes being Managerial Accounting and the Decision Process, Internal Auditing, Intermediate Macroeconomics, and Strategic Management. So yeah, that's all I got for this story time. Thank you all so much for watching this story time, and I'll catch y'all on Storytime 58 whenever I decide to upload one. But yeah, that's all I got.